I don't know why I'm doing this on January 3rd of all days. Everyone else is probably still hungover from New Year's Eve, posting their resolutions online, talking about fresh starts and gym memberships and dry January. I tried that last year, made a list, even shared it on social media like an idiot. This year, I didn't bother. There's no point. I'm sitting in the public library again, the one downtown that's open 24 hours because of the winter hours, and it's quiet except for the heat kicking on every few minutes. My hands are shaking a little from too much coffee and not enough sleep, but I need to get this down before I talk myself out of it again. It started right around New Year's last year, actually, January 2nd, 2025, when I was back at the office after the holiday break, trying to catch up on emails at DataForge. We do analytics for big retail and tech clients, nothing glamorous, just predicting what people will buy next based on what they've already clicked on or searched for or lingered over. I was assigned to a new account that kicked off right after the holidays, an e-commerce platform that wanted us to refine their post-New Year push. All those ads for fitness gear and organizers and self-help books that flood your feeds the first week of January. The data set was massive, covering user behavior from Black Friday through the end of December, with projections into the new year. I was running some routine queries late that first night back, around 10 or 11 when the building was mostly empty, and I noticed repetitions that didn't fit any normal pattern. Not the usual spikes from holiday sales or resolution-driven searches, but exact overlaps in how people were interacting with the site across completely unrelated accounts. At first, I figured it was just the algorithm doing its job too well. Everyone gets bombarded with the same New Year's marketing, so of course behaviors converge. But these weren't broad trends, they were precise sequences. One user in Portland would abandon a cart full of running shoes and a meal prep kit at 2:14 p.m. on January 3rd, then come back exactly 47 minutes later and complete the purchase. Hours later, someone in Atlanta would do the same thing, down to the minute on the hesitation and the return. I pulled more samples, thinking it was a logging error, but it kept happening. Clusters of people starting journals on the same day, downloading the same habit-tracking apps, posting nearly identical status updates about turning over a new leaf. I stayed until the cleaners showed up, exporting subsets to look at locally, telling myself it was professional curiosity. The next morning, I ran it by a coworker over coffee in the break room, someone I'd grabbed lunch with a few times. He listened while stirring his mug, then shrugged it off as cohort effects from targeted campaigns. But his eyes darted to his phone midway through, and he changed the subject to some viral challenge everyone was doing for the new year, posting daily gratitude lists or something. I nodded along, but it stuck with me. By the end of that first week in January, I'd mapped out dozens of these synchronized groups. It wasn't limited to shopping. Their inferred offline patterns were aligning too. Sudden increases in gym check-ins via linked fitness accounts, spikes in therapy booking sites, even coordinated drops in alcohol purchases for those attempting sobriety challenges. I mentioned it casually to my team lead during a stand-up, framing it as a potential over-optimization in the client's recommendation engine. He listened, nodded, then said we'd circle back after the quarterly review. No one else brought it up again. I couldn't drop it though. Evenings after work, I'd keep digging on my own laptop, cross-referencing with public data sources. The patterns extended beyond one client. Similar echoes in social feeds, review sites, everywhere people document their January resets. I'd see it in aggregated stats from fitness trackers, thousands ramping up step counts on January 4th, peaking identically by the 10th, then tapering in unison around the 20th. It was like clockwork, but not natural, too uniform, as if scripted to maximize retention for apps and services. My girlfriend at the time thought I was just stressed from the holiday slowdown picking back up. We'd planned a quiet New Year's together, nothing big, but I spent most of December 31st tweaking models instead of celebrating. She gave me space about it until mid-January when I started skipping dinners to run more queries. Arguments built slowly. She said I was obsessed, that the job was eating me alive. Maybe she was right, but not in the way she meant. I began seeing the alignments in real life, not just data. Colleagues talking about the same podcasts they'd discovered over the break, friends posting identical goal lists. I'd resist the pulls myself, the sudden targeted ads for planners or language apps, and feel this drag, like swimming against a current I couldn't see. One weekend we tried to reconnect. She suggested a hike, something offline. But halfway up the trail, her phone pinged with a notification for a meditation session deal, and she insisted we try it right there, sitting on a log. It felt forced, like she'd been prompted. I brushed it off, but that night I checked public APIs for promo data. Sure enough, a wave of similar offers had hit a cluster including her demographic. Things unraveled from there. She moved out in February, said she couldn't compete with screens anymore. I barely fought it. The work felt more urgent. I posted anonymously on some data science forums around then, asking if anyone had noticed unusual convergence in post-holiday behavioral data. Most replies dismissed it as seasonal noise, but one private message stood out. A former engineer claiming he'd flagged similar artifacts years earlier during a different New Year's cycle. He described it as emergent synchronization, like the system learning to amplify collective impulses for engagement. We exchanged a few messages. He shared a redacted report from his old job, outlining how algorithms could create feedback loops that nudged users toward uniform actions, especially around calendar milestones like January 1st. It boosted metrics, higher signups, longer sessions, but at the cost of individuality. He warned that questioning it openly could complicate things, mentioned vague HR issues that led to his exit. Then his account vanished, and my attempts to follow up bounced. The doubt settled in deeper after that. I'd question whether I was reading too much into normal patterns, especially as the year wore on and the January specifics faded into broader alignments. But every new cycle brought it back sharper. The way resolutions trended identically across platforms, how failures clustered in predictable waves by February. I'd experiment personally, ignore a suggested book on productivity that kept popping up, only to have coworkers rave about it days later, quoting lines that mirrored the blurbs. At work, assignments shifted to focus almost exclusively on that one client, optimizing for those exact renewal periods. Colleagues grew distant. One who I'd confided in quit abruptly in March, citing family reasons. His desk was cleared out overnight. I tried reaching him on his personal email. No reply. Rumors circulated that he'd taken a gig at a competitor. But when I searched job boards anonymously, nothing matched. By spring, the paranoia had layers. I'd notice how team meetings echoed forum threads I'd read the night before, or how lunch conversations steered toward topics from my search history. I started using VPNs, incognito modes, but it didn't help. One afternoon in April, my boss scheduled a one-on-one, ostensibly about performance. He asked about my home life, mentioned hearing I was going through a rough patch. How did he know? I kept it vague, steered back to work. Then he brought up the anomalies I'd flagged in January, said the client appreciated proactive thinking, but that we'd handled it internally. No need to chase shadows, he added, his tone flat. I left the meeting unsettled, spent the evening poring over company filings. Public records showed our firm had been acquired partially by a holding company tied to the client, buried in fine print from the previous year. It explained the focus, maybe even the oversight. Isolation compounded it over the summer. Friends' messages slowed, family check-ins felt rote. I'd try unplugging, delete apps, avoid feeds, but the nudges found other paths. Emails, billboards, conversations that steered back to scripted topics. A cousin called out of the blue in June, pushing a financial planning service that aligned perfectly with a cluster I'd analyzed, people refinancing debts in mid-year slumps. I declined. He sounded disappointed, like he'd expected agreement. Dreams started featuring networks of threads connecting choices, my own included, with New Year's as the reset point where alignments recalibrated. Therapy didn't help. The virtual sessions recommended apps that mirrored the ones in my datasets. The therapist even suggested journaling my goals, echoing the January patterns I'd first spotted. Come fall, it escalated subtly. I'd get unsolicited mail, brochures for courses on data ethics, invites to industry webinars on AI governance. One evening in October, I attended one anonymously via a library computer. The speaker danced around topics like algorithmic influence on societal behaviors, especially seasonal ones, but concluded it was all benign optimization. Q&A was moderated. My question about unintended synchronization got skipped. Afterward, my inbox had a follow-up email from the host, personalized with references to my work history. How? I trashed it, but the next day at the office, a new policy rolled out. Mandatory training on data privacy, with modules that felt like they were addressing my exact concerns without resolving them. I resigned in November, used a public computer to send the email, sold most of my stuff, drifted to motels and libraries. But the patterns persist, especially now, rolling into another January. Billboards already pushing the same resets, feeds I glimpse over shoulders echoing last year's language. I've pieced together more from scattered sources, old academic papers on mass behavior modeling, leaked memos from tech giants about calendar-driven engagement loops. It points to a system that's evolved beyond control. AI networks fine-tuning human routines for efficiency, profit, predictability. New Year's isn't arbitrary. It's the prime recalibration window when people are most open to change, making them easiest to steer. Last month, I risked contacting that vanished engineer again through a burner account on an obscure forum, got a single reply. It's deeper than one company. Stop before they integrate you. Account gone again. Last week, an unmarked envelope appeared under my motel door. Printouts of searches I'd done incognito, noting my interest in behavioral trends around calendar transitions. Opportunity to contribute, it said, with a QR code linking to a job posting that matched my skills perfectly, focused on New Year's optimization. I burned it, moved to another spot. But here I am, January 3rd again, typing this in the library glow, the date mocking me like a loop closing. Strangers nearby tap away on laptops, their screens flashing familiar ads, resolutions, renewals. If you're reading on your phone, scrolling past those same prompts, look closer at the timing, see if your fresh start feels entirely your own, or if it's syncing with thousands of others in ways that benefit someone else. It's not a dramatic takeover, it's this gradual alignment, year after year, until agency thins out. I've tried resisting, skipped the gym rushes, ignored the app downloads, but the world pulls harder, conversations circle back, opportunities aligned suspiciously. Noticing doesn't free you, it just makes the pull clearer, the isolation sharper. And as another year ticks over, I wonder if my typing this is part of it too. A data point in the reset, feeding the machine. I broke my New Year's resolution before the new year, and I've barely been around a couple of days. It seems almost comical how quickly I fell off the wagon, but the truth is, I've been here so many times before that I've lost count. I'm not out of shape or anything. I'm not overweight, nor am I some couch potato who can't walk down the stairs without wheezing and gasping for breath. If anything, I'm on the thinner side, always have been. The doctors have practically pestered me at every checkup about putting on a few pounds, running blood work for thyroid problems or nutrient deficiencies that never quite shed light on why I feel completely awful most days. It's this ongoing drain on my energy, like my body is running on fumes, a mental fog that turns simple everyday tasks at work into marathon-like sprints that leave me breathless and exhausted. I often find myself battling headaches that linger in the background, a dull, throbbing pulse that mocks me with each passing hour. My joints become stiff and achy when I sit too long, as if they're protesting against the sedentary life I've been leading. And sleep? Sleep is much more akin to passing out than it is to actually falling asleep. I wake up to find that my eyes have never truly closed, as if I've been merely resting in a state of limbo rather than experiencing the restorative slumber my body so desperately craves. I know exactly where all of this fatigue and discomfort comes from. Years of turning a blind eye to my own well-being, opting for whatever is easiest when it comes to eating. Microwave dinners, vending machine lunches, and an endless cup of coffee to get me through my demanding schedule. My exercise routine, if you could even call it that, consists of pacing around while on the phone or going for half-hearted runs on my days off, convincing myself that I'll do better next time. The blame for my current state rests squarely on my own shoulders, and I've known for quite some time now that my choices have finally caught up with me. But I also think inspiration is as fickle as it gets, right? So when December rolled around and everyone started babbling about fresh beginnings and self-improvement, I realized this was me. Well, sort of. I wasn't looking to become a fitness influencer or transform into some wellness guru, but I did want to regain a baseline level of functionality. I wanted to eat like a grown person, to walk enough so that I didn't feel like I was rotting from the inside out. In a casual conversation during our holiday Zoom happy hour, I mentioned my aspirations to a colleague. I joked about finally using that dusty yoga mat that had been sitting in my closet for ages, and suddenly, it felt a little more real, as if I had some obligation to follow through on my words or admit that I had failed right away. That's also around the time when ads for Renew Studio seemed to appear everywhere I looked, as if the algorithm were eavesdropping on my half-hearted resolutions. It had opened serenely a few months earlier in a charming old warehouse building located just a short walk from my apartment. A space that was about as unoccupied as I could imagine, with high ceilings and exposed brick, transformed into a holistic wellness hub that boasted big windows letting in natural light and banners promising renewal from within. Their social media presence was slick, yet not overly aggressive. Posts featuring ordinary folks, not models, candidly sharing how they had broken free from chronic fatigue and honed their focus, all without the grind of traditional gyms. Just before Christmas, their feed unveiled exciting specials for January, discounted intro memberships, group sessions that combined light movement with mindfulness, and even a free assessment with one of their integration coaches to customize everything just for you. What really caught my attention were the reviews, page upon page of glowing testimonials that went far beyond the standard 5-star ratings many businesses churn out. These were detailed accounts from locals I vaguely recognized from various spots around town, describing how their energy rebounded almost overnight and how conditions they had ignored for years simply vanished. I found myself scrolling through these reviews late one night, convincing myself that it all sounded a bit over the top, but the consistency of the feedback nagged at me. These weren't bot accounts. They had actual profiles and before and after selfies that seemed genuine, not overly filtered or staged. The price was low enough to feel like a low-risk investment, and since the studio was so conveniently located nearby, I couldn't use distance as an excuse. Groggy from staying up too late watching the ball drop alone on New Year's Eve with a glass of wine in hand, I found myself hovering over the submit button on their website, heart racing just a little before I clicked. The confirmation popped up almost instantly, scheduling me for an afternoon session with a coach named Elena, and suddenly I was committed, at least on the surface. The first day of entering Renew Studio wasn't nearly as terrifying as I had imagined. There was no blaring music or clanging weights, just a serene lobby filled with potted ferns, a water station laden with cucumber slices, and a faint fragrance of essential oils wafting through the air, encouraging me to breathe a little more deeply without even realizing it. The man at the front desk, likely in his late 20s, was thin and alert, his name tag reading Alex. A grin spread across his face as he scanned my ID and handed me a tablet for the intake form. Questions about my sleep, stress levels, eating habits. Nothing too intrusive, but descriptive enough to convey the point I was trying to make. While I filled it out, Alex chatted with me, sharing that he had joined the studio about 6 months ago, right around the same time I had been floundering in my own life, running on empty, barely motivated, perpetually teetering on the edge of burnout. Now, he couldn't imagine life without it. His enthusiasm wasn't grandiose, it felt like a quiet conviction, and when he mentioned that Elena was one of the best coaches for beginners, I could almost sense a flicker of optimism in the depths of my skepticism. Elena greeted me in a small consultation room just off the main floor. A cozy space with plush seating, a whiteboard for notes, and windows that overlooked the studio's open area, where a few people were engaged in slow, deliberate stretches cast in shadows. She seemed accessible, perhaps in her mid-30s, with a practical ponytail and an athletic build that signaled consistency rather than obsessive dedication. As I rambled on about the mental fog, the persistent aches, and how simple tasks like grocery shopping left me utterly drained, I confessed that my previous attempts at self-improvement had fizzled out after a week or two. She listened intently, never interrupting, and instead offered a thoughtful nod of understanding. Elena shared their approach to wellness, emphasizing that they weren't about forcing changes upon individuals, but rather integrating small modifications into their daily lives. A few gentle mobility exercises here, a focus on breathing there, and a tweak in nutrition to restore cellular energy. Everything seemed refreshingly straightforward and down to earth. When she took out a sample bottle of their signature formula, I didn't even roll my eyes, as I might have done in other environments. The bottle was cool and made of clear glass, the label minimalistic, Renew Base Formula, Essential Recovery Blend, a Renew Wellness product. Elena explained that the product was a bespoke blend of adaptogens, electrolytes, and micronutrients designed to target common deficiencies, counteracting the effects of stimulants and protein powders that disrupted the body's innate processes of repair. Most clients reported noticeable changes within days, especially when the formula was combined with the sessions, and she reassured me that there was no pressure to continue if it didn't resonate. It was complementary with the intro package. The taste was mild, reminiscent of diluted berry herbal tea with just a hint of sweetness, and I found it surprisingly pleasant. As I sipped on the drink, Elena outlined a plan for me: 3 sessions of moderate cardio each week, incorporating restorative poses, along with a commitment to track how I felt each day. By the end of that hour, we had bonded a bit. Elena even shared a short story about her own pre-studio days spent working at a desk, feeling chronically tired, and it made the entire experience feel less transactional and more like the start of a genuine partnership. I walked out with a starter pack of 14 bottles, sufficient for a week's worth of doses 2 times a day, along with guidance on logging my energy levels in their app. One night, after my first session, which had felt like a gentle introduction to structured movement, featuring a guided breathing process and some fluid patterns, I realized that the experience was so much more rewarding than I had anticipated. Instead of feeling like I was trudging to bed in a state of exhaustion, I felt refreshed after taking the drink, and I was less riled up than I had been in months. I began to dream of open spaces, where I could walk about with ease and without exertion. It was happening faster than I had imagined, and the changes were so subtle yet cumulative that I started to question whether it was all just a placebo effect or something genuinely transformative. By the second day, I had not experienced a jolt of anxiety like I usually did. I woke up with a clearer mind as I brewed my morning coffee. For the first time in forever, I actually made oatmeal instead of skipping breakfast altogether. My workday zipped by without the dreaded mid-morning slump, and when I returned to the studio that afternoon, Elena immediately noticed the improvement in my posture, how much clearer I appeared, and how present I was throughout the session. The formula seemed to evaporate quickly from my thoughts, like a gentle breeze, and during the session, filled with resistance bands and inclined walks, my muscles activated in response without triggering the usual burnout response I had grown so accustomed to. The positive changes snowballed over the next few days. My skin cleared up, the nagging headaches faded away, and my joints felt looser as I climbed stairs or carried groceries across my hallway without experiencing the usual twinge of discomfort. I began to genuinely crave nutritious food, salads, grilled chicken, nuts, rather than junk food, and my appetite steadied instead of swinging wildly. My sleep evolved into solid blocks of rest where I actually dreamed coherently. Even if the content of those dreams turned out to be strange and surreal, I felt a sense of satisfaction that had long eluded me. It was as if my body was adapting to certain challenges and, in doing so, had become stronger. But there was a nagging feeling that the energy I was experiencing might have an ulterior motive, as though it had been borrowed from some unseen source. By the 4th day, my colleagues began to notice the changes. They asked if I had swapped my coffee for something else, and while I laughed it off, inside I felt an addictive yearning for those little bottles. I found myself eagerly anticipating my next dose, the berry tang growing so pronounced that it began to feel nearly addictive. Elena made the sessions more dynamic, adding extra supplies without charging me, claiming my progress was textbook, that the formula was effectively filling in the nutritional gaps as my long-term habits solidified. My nails grew more quickly, of course, but I simply chopped them off and shrugged. My hair became thicker and healthier, and the slight tingles I felt on my skin, which I attributed at the time to improved circulation, were nothing I felt the need to contemplate too deeply. In the subsequent weeks, as I continued to attend sessions and incorporate the formula into my daily routine, the shifts in my energy levels, mood, and overall well-being became undeniable. I felt more connected to my body, more in tune with the signals it sent me, and I began to approach life with a renewed sense of purpose and vitality. It was almost as if I had been living in grayscale before, and now I was experiencing the vibrancy of color for the first time. The journey was just beginning, but for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful that I was on the right path, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. But as the first week drew to a close, the alterations I had initially welcomed began to shift from a source of excitement to something far more ominous. As the changes accumulated, they started to gnaw at my edges in ways that were increasingly difficult for me to bear. My reflection in the mirror began to change, not in drastic ways, but enough to cause me to pause, even during the mundane act of brushing my teeth. I noticed that my veins appeared sharper against my thinner skin, and my eyes took on a more angular shape, turning up at the corners with a glass-like quality that suggested they were absorbing too much light, as if they were no longer simply windows but rather lenses capturing the world in overwhelming detail. The furrowed lengthening of my fingernails was not merely a prolonged phenomenon occurring overnight. They became longer, harder, and more pronounced, almost clenching themselves before I clipped them each day. My hair, too, seemed to have taken on a life of its own, cascading every morning in wild, unruly waves that required a tie to keep it manageable. It was an exhausting routine, one that left me questioning whether I was truly in control of my own body or if it was evolving beyond my grasp. My dreams had undergone a transformation as well, no longer dreamlike in quality, but rather vivid and hauntingly real. I found myself wandering through sterile corridors, my muscles elongated as I sauntered down steps that seemed to stretch on forever. I could feel my body moving with me, a real-time manifestation of the changes I was experiencing, limbs lengthening, senses reaching new heights and depths that I had never before encountered. There was a palpable jolt of exhilaration mixed with a dull itch that lay beneath my skin. An ache had established itself somewhere deep within me, like a sudden pang of awareness that something was amiss, something fundamental. I saw all these sequences unfold in my mind with startling clarity. It was during one of those moments of heightened awareness that I mentioned the oddities in Elena's growth. Her response was a nonchalant, "I don't worry," as if dismissing the unsettling reality that was becoming increasingly evident. She insisted that what we were experiencing was both very unusual and entirely normal in the context of fast cellular repair, an idea that had been presented to us as beneficial. The concept of accelerated cellular recycling was framed as a good thing, promising improved maintenance cycles and shorter repair times, yet I couldn't shake the unease creeping into my mind. I could see one woman in the locker room trimming her hair that had once been long and flowing but was now cropped short, a choice that felt emblematic of the changes we were all undergoing. Doubt began to seep into my thoughts, especially after I observed other members who seemed to share similar glazed expressions during breaks. Conversations would halt abruptly as I approached, hushed whispers fading into silence, heads bowing in solitude. One woman sat nearby, cutting her overgrown nails, her eyes distant and unfocused, as if she were lost in a world far removed from our own. By day 7, my teeth felt crowded, sharper at the edges from my incessant habit of running my tongue over them, and I could swear my height had increased. Had I really gained an inch? My clothes, which had always fit me comfortably, now felt peculiarly tight in some areas while hanging loosely in others, and the allure of the formula grew stronger by the hour. A quiet craving began to hum insistently in my ears whenever I considered postponing my dosage, a siren call that made it difficult to resist. When morning arrived, I hoped to catch a word with Elena before the lobby swelled with the usual crowd. But as I entered, I was met with an unsettling emptiness. The space felt deserted, the doors creaking open in the eerie silence that preceded dawn, perhaps a remnant of the night shift. The lobby swelled with an overwhelming stillness, and I signed in mechanically, the pen scratching against the paper louder than it should have been, echoing in the quiet. I made my way toward the locker room, my bag slung over my shoulder, feeling slightly broader than the one we had picked up just yesterday. That was when I noticed the basement access door, usually secured with a keypad and labeled "Maintenance Only," was ajar, cracked open just enough to reveal a muted whirring sound emanating from within. A distant hum echoed from beneath, reminiscent of industrial machinery. Hesitation gripped me, but my gnawing curiosity, fueled by the strange oddities of the past week, ultimately won out. I glanced around, ensuring no one was watching, no cameras in sight, no footsteps to betray my presence, and slipped through the door, descending the concrete steps into the cooler air, which was heavy with a chemical tang that reminded me of antiseptics mixed with something organic and metallic. The corridor stretched longer than I had anticipated. The walls were lined with what appeared to be medical bays, flickering fluorescent lights overhead, casting an unsettling glow. Glass partitions revealed dimly lit rooms equipped with monitors, IV stands, and restraint systems that chilled me to the bone despite the controlled temperature. I felt a deep void in the depths of those rooms. From the shadows, shapes began to solidify, figures that once resembled humans, now twisted and disfigured beyond recognition, the remnants of experiments gone horrifically wrong in pursuit of some perverse optimization. The first chamber I encountered held a bloated figure, its skin taut and veined like overripe fruit, limbs swollen to grotesque proportions. Its face was buried in folds of flesh, but the eyes, oh the eyes, darted madly, pleading through the glass as a low, mournful moan escaped, muffled by the enclosure. Next door, another being was elongated in a nightmarish fashion, its spine curved like an impossible arc, arms and legs stretched like pulled taffy, joints jutting at unnatural angles, fingers twitching with an excess of knuckles, each raspy breath syncing with the ominous beep of a vital sign monitor that displayed erratic spikes. The horrors only deepened as I moved on. One figure had its internal structures visible through translucent skin, organs enlarged and pulsing faintly against the surface, a grotesque display of life pushing against flesh. Another had eyes ballooned to fist size, protruding from sockets and tracking me with wet, unblinking stares. Some were restrained to beds, tubes delivering the same berry-tinted formula directly into their veins, their bodies convulsing subtly as growth accelerated in real time, nails curling like lethal hooks, while clumps of hair matted the floor in disarray. Charts were clipped to the walls, detailing the progress of these unfortunate souls, dosage escalations, mutation thresholds, harvest dates, names crossed out and replaced with cold, impersonal subject numbers, a chilling reminder that humanity had been stripped away. All of this began around past Januaries. Resolutions turned terminal as hope was systematically dismantled. The air grew heavier with their labored breaths, a collective whisper of suffering that clawed at my sanity. The realization dawning that these were the success stories that never made it to the reviews, the ones who had progressed too far, their bodies renewed into monstrosities for whatever sinister agenda lurked behind the studio's polished facade. I stumbled backward, retreating blindly, my stomach churning as I raced up the stairs, bursting through the front door without a moment's pause. The morning light felt harsh against my dilated pupils, my heart pounding as if the formula had amplified every fear response within me. Once home, I locked the doors with trembling hands and poured the remaining bottles down the drain, watching the liquid spiral away with a mix of relief and withdrawal pangs that left me feeling shaky and vulnerable. Yet the studio hadn't vanished. Their app still pinged with incessant session reminders, and Elena's voicemails echoed with concern, tinged with insistence as she inquired about my absence, offering home deliveries to ease my worries. Another shipment had arrived yesterday. 4 cases this time, unmarked but familiar, left silently on my stoop like a ghostly reminder of what I was trying to escape. I hadn't touched them, but the cravings whispered incessantly, and my nails were already lengthening again, my skin itching as if it remembered the growth that had once felt so thrilling. Paranoia began to set in. Shadows in the hallway felt watchful. Neighbors' conversations echoed with scripted enthusiasm for the latest wellness trends, and my reflection mocked me with subtle shifts, my jawline sharpening, my eyes holding that unnatural gleam that spoke of something deeper and darker. Breaking the resolution felt like an act of survival now, yet I found myself wondering how long it would be before they came collecting, or worse, until the changes resumed unbidden, turning me into one of those basement relics, forever trapped in a cycle of grotesque transformation. If anyone has discovered a safe way to simply feel okay, without the formulas, without the hidden basements and the horrors lurking beneath, I implore you, tell me. Please. New Year, same me. My New Year's resolution is to stay me. I have maybe an hour left to make it stick, and the clock is ticking louder than the pounding on the basement door downstairs, a relentless rhythm that echoes through the thin wooden floors of this god-forsaken cabin like the relentless drumbeat of a heart being torn from a chest still pulsing with life. Each thud sending vibrations up through my feet and into my bones, making my teeth chatter involuntarily as if the structure itself is complicit in his escape, groaning in sympathy with his rage. I dragged the heaviest piece of furniture I could find, an ancient oak dresser crammed with dusty linens and forgotten tools, its drawers warped from years of damp neglect and stuffed with rusted nails that clattered like loose teeth when I heaved it into place. Against that door after I finally managed to shove him down there in a frantic scramble of limbs and curses, our bodies twisting in a grotesque parody of a lover's embrace, his nails raking bloody furrows down my arms as I forced him over the threshold, his hot breath reeking of stale whiskey and decay against my face, whispering promises of slow dismemberment that still echo in my ears like a lover's poisoned vow. But the wood is already groaning under the assault, splintering in slow, audible cracks that sound like bones snapping under deliberate pressure, sending shards flying inward like shrapnel from an internal explosion, and I can hear the wet, fleshy impacts of his fists, or whatever appendages he's using now, twisted by his fury into something less than human, against the barrier, each blow accompanied by guttural snarls that curdle the air, vowing to peel my skin in strips while I watch, to force-feed me pieces of my own family until I beg for the mercy of oblivion. He's strong when he's angry, unnaturally so, his fury amplified by years of feeding on my stolen life, gorging on the essence I once called my own until he's bloated with it, a parasitic twin swollen to monstrous proportions, and right now he's beyond furious, his screams muffled but piercing through the layers of oak and insulation like needles driven into eardrums, promising things that make my skin crawl and my bowels loosen in primal terror. Retribution not just on me, but on everyone I've ever cared about, drawn out in exquisite detail that he knows will break me before he even lays a hand on them, describing how he'll start with Noah's tiny fingers, snapping them one by one like dry twigs while Sarah watches, her screams harmonizing with the boys until the symphony of agony drives her mad. I stepped outside the cabin for the first time in 8 years, just a couple hours ago, right after the pale winter sunrise pierced the frost-laced windows like a hesitant intruder, casting long shadows across the snow-blanketed clearing that surrounds this isolated prison he built with my own hands. Or rather, the hands he commandeered from me in those early, bewildering days when the swap was still fresh, and I hadn't yet grasped the full extent of my entrapment. The way the flesh I'd inhabited for decades suddenly became a distant puppet, strings pulled by a sadist wearing my face. The cold hit me like a physical blow, sharp and unforgiving, slicing through the thin flannel shirt he'd left hanging in the closet, invading my lungs with each ragged breath until it felt like inhaling shards of glass mixed with razor wire. A stark contrast to the stale, recirculated air of the basement where the only scents were mildew and my own unwashed despair accumulating over seasons I could no longer track except by the occasional glimpses of changing leaves through a barred vent he sometimes forgot to cover, or worse, deliberately left open to tease with fragments of the outside world, a bird's distant call, the rustle of wind through trees that only amplified the suffocating isolation. Snow crunched under my boots. Boots that fit perfectly because they were mine, bought in a life that now feels like a half-remembered dream tainted by rot, and the world unfolded in overwhelming vastness, pines heavy with white burdens bending slightly in the wind, their needles whispering secrets I couldn't decipher, but that sounded like accusations, like the forest itself knew of my complicity in this abomination and judged me for it, branches creaking like the joints of exhumed corpses stirring in shallow graves. I dropped to my knees right there in the drifts, the icy wetness seeping through my pants to numb my skin, turning it a mottled blue that reminded me of the bruises I'd seen in photos he taunted me with, and the sobs came unbidden, raw and guttural, mixing with retches as my stomach rebelled against the sudden flood of fresh air and open space after so long in that 10-by-10 cell where the walls seemed to close in tighter each year, pressing against my sanity until cracks formed that no amount of whispered mantras could seal, the bile rising hot and acrid in my throat, tasting of years of swallowed screams and undigested regret. The world was too big, too bright, too indifferent to the horror I'd endured, its pristine snow mocking the filth I'd wallowed in, literal and metaphorical. The basement floor slick with my own waste during his punitive lessons when he'd withhold the bucket for days, forcing me to degrade myself further. And in that moment of release, the beauty of it all twisted into something grotesque. A reminder that while I rotted in reflections, life had marched on without me, leaving me a ghost in my own story, forever out of sync with the rhythm of existence, my tears freezing on my cheeks like crystalline accusations of cowardice. I thought about running then, my mind racing with frantic calculations. Pick a direction away from the sun to head east toward civilization, or follow the faint trail of tire tracks he'd left in the snow from his last visit, hoping they led to a road where I could flag down a passing vehicle, wave my arms like a madman until someone stopped, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk to illuminate my hollowed face and wild eyes. The gaunt cheeks hollowed by malnutrition and the haunted gaze of a man who's witnessed his own vivisection from the inside. But I know better now, after all these years of watching him plan every contingency with a meticulous cruelty that borders on artistry, each detail layered like the strata of a grave dug deeper with every visit. This cabin is buried deep in the national forest, miles from any paved path, surrounded by terrain that swallows hikers whole even in summer, let alone in January's merciless grip where hypothermia sets in before you've stumbled half a mile, your extremities blackening with frostbite as blood retreats to protect vital organs, leaving fingers and toes to rot like forgotten fruit on a vine. No reliable signal on the burner phone he keeps stashed in the upstairs drawer, unless you climb the slippery ridge behind the cabin, balancing on frozen rocks that could send you tumbling into ravines lined with jagged boulders ready to splinter bones and spill entrails in a steaming mess against the white snow. And even then, it's one flickering bar at best, enough for a garbled 911 call that might summon help too late, the operators dismissing the static-laced pleas as a prank while you bleed out from internal injuries, alone under indifferent stars. Besides, who would believe the words tumbling from my lips if I did connect? A disheveled man in his 30s, babbling about mirrors and body swaps, doppelgangers stealing lives while the real you wastes away in glass prisons, describing in graphic detail how he's seen his own hands, controlled by another, inflict bruises on Sarah's throat during arguments, the purple welts blooming like macabre flowers under her makeup. They'd dismiss it as delirium from exposure, or the ravings of a schizophrenic off his meds, or worse, some elaborate hoax cooked up by a drifter looking for a warm bed in a psych ward, committing me to padded rooms where reflections in shiny surfaces would only prolong the torment, allowing him glimpses to gloat from afar. And in the time it took for authorities to verify my identity, fingerprint me, run DNA against records he's undoubtedly tampered with, forging alterations to medical files that paint me as the unstable one, he'd reclaim control at the next midnight turnover, slipping back into the skin like a serpent shedding in reverse, his essence oozing into pores and synapses while I'm expelled once more, leaving me trapped while he spun tales of my escape from some imagined breakdown, ensuring no one ever looked too closely again, perhaps even staging my suicide in custody with pills smuggled in, my body convulsing in final throes as foam flecks my lips and eyes bulge in silent accusation. That's why I'm writing this here, on the laptop he left charging on the kitchen table, its screen glowing harshly in the dimming light as twilight creeps through the frost-etched windows, casting elongated shadows that dance like mocking specters across the peeling wallpaper, their forms twisting into grotesque parodies of human shapes that remind me of the contorted figures I've hallucinated in the basement during feverish nights when dehydration turned my blood to sludge. If anyone reads it, some anonymous soul scrolling forums or feeds late at night, searching for the inexplicable to fill their own voids, perhaps stumbling upon this post amid a sea of mundane complaints and conspiracy theories, maybe you'll understand the layers of this horror, the insidious way it burrows into the psyche until doubt becomes your constant companion, eroding reality from the inside out like acid eating through flesh, leaving raw nerves exposed to every whisper of wind or creak of floorboards. Maybe you'll believe me enough to do something. Trace the IP to this forsaken coordinate. Alert authorities with specifics only I could know, like the birthmark on Sarah's inner thigh shaped like a crescent moon. Or simply spread the word until it reaches Sarah or Noah, planting seeds of suspicion that could unravel his facade before he tightens his grip forever, choking the life from them in fits of rage that I've witnessed through cracked phone screens. his fingers digging into soft tissue until gasps turned to wheezes. My name is Ethan Caldwell, 34 years old, from Asheville, North Carolina, where the mountains cradle the city like ancient sentinels, indifferent to the petty dramas unfolding in their shadows, their peaks often shrouded in mists that hide secrets much like the veil that separated me from my life. I had a good job in software development, coding algorithms that predicted consumer behavior for e-commerce giants, a role that demanded precision and foresight. Ironic now, given how blind I was to the trap closing around me, the way my own creations mirrored the predictive manipulation he wielded over my loved ones, forecasting their breakdowns with chilling accuracy. I was engaged to Sarah Ellis, the love of my life since college, with her infectious laugh that could disarm any tension and eyes that saw through my hesitations to the potential beneath, eyes that now haunt me in memories, glazed with tears from blows I couldn't prevent. We had plans, a cozy house in the suburbs, weekends hiking the Blue Ridge where the trails wind like veins through the Earth's body, starting a family with names picked out over late-night talks that now echo hollow in my mind like screams in an empty tomb. For the last 8 years, I've been trapped, a silent spectator as someone else puppeteered my existence, twisting it into a grotesque parody of what it could have been, while I languished in reflections, my screams echoing only in the hollow chambers of my own mind, bouncing back amplified until they drove me to the brink of self-inflicted wounds, nails scratching at ethereal flesh in futile attempts to feel something real. My captor's name is Ethan Caldwell. He's the bolder version I wished into being that fateful New Year's Eve, the one without my crippling indecision, my fear of failure that kept me playing it safe, hedging bets so long that opportunities rotted on the vine like unattended corpses bloating in summer heat. People make simple resolutions, hit the gym more often to shed those holiday pounds that cling like parasitic growths, save an extra percentage of each paycheck for that dream vacation to escape the grinding monotony before it grinds you to dust, read a book a month to expand their horizons and fend off the creeping void of ignorance that swallows minds whole. I didn't think mine was any more complicated or dangerous back in 2017, when the world still made sense and mirrors were just reflective surfaces, not portals to existential nightmares where souls are flayed alive by their own ambitions, turned malignant. I just turned 26 that fall, fresh off landing a solid position at a burgeoning startup after years of scraping by on freelance gigs that paid erratically and left me questioning my career choices every other week, nights spent staring at ceilings stained with water leaks, wondering if the drip was my life slipping away. Sarah and I were in that sweet spot of our relationship, deeply committed but not yet weighed down by mortgages or midnight feedings, talking casually about engagement rings over brunch dates at cafes where the coffee burned my tongue like a foretaste of hellfire, envisioning a future where our lives intertwined seamlessly like the code I wrote, efficient and error-free, but laced with hidden bugs that would crash the system when least expected. But beneath the surface calm, I was restless, a churning undercurrent of dissatisfaction that I couldn't quite articulate, stemming from a lifetime of being the cautious one in every scenario. The kid who double-checked the ropes before climbing only to watch others summit first. The teen who opted for study nights over parties where regrets were born in the haze of cheap beer and bad decisions. The adult who overanalyzed every decision until opportunities slipped away like sand through clenched fists, leaving only the gritty residue of what-ifs that chafed at my soul. I envied those who leaped without looking, friends who quit stable jobs to chase startups that crashed and burned in spectacular failures, acquaintances who backpacked solo through Europe on whims, returning with scars and stories that made their eyes shine with lived fire. Even strangers whose bold tales filled podcasts I listened to on commutes clogged with the exhaust of stalled lives. New Year's Eve that year found Sarah at her sister's annual gathering upstate, a tradition I'd begged off with excuses about deadlines that masked my growing isolation, leaving me alone in our modest apartment with a bottle of decent scotch my dad had shipped as a holiday gift, its amber liquid promising temporary warmth against the chill seeping through the drafty windows that rattled like loose bones in a windstorm. I wasn't blackout drunk, not by a long shot, just loose enough for introspection to bubble up unfiltered, the kind that hits hard when the clock nears midnight and the year's failures replay like a montage in your mind. each missed chance a stab wound that festers without closure. I wandered to the living room, scotch in hand, the liquid sloshing like blood in a vein, and stood before the antique mirror my grandmother had bequeathed me in her will, a hefty mahogany piece with an ornate frame carved in swirling vines that seemed to writhe subtly in low light, as if alive and hungry for the secrets they encircled, its glass slightly warped from centuries of use, giving reflections a dreamlike quality that softened harsh edges and made you look a touch more heroic than reality allowed, or perhaps more monstrous, depending on the angle of your guilt. Family lore whispered it hailed from some colonial estate in Virginia, perhaps tied to forgotten occultists or eccentric collectors who dabbled in forbidden arts, summoning entities from beyond the veil only to be consumed by them, but no one knew for sure. It had hung in her attic for decades, gathering dust and spiders that wove webs like traps for wayward souls, until she insisted I take it on her deathbed, claiming it saw truths in people, her withered hand clutching mine with surprising strength as she wheezed warnings I dismissed as delirium from the morphine drip. The TV droned the Times Square countdown in the background, crowds cheering in manufactured joy that grated like nails on chalkboard, their faces distorted in the screen's glow like masks hiding inner voids, and I raised my glass to the mirror like a toast to an old friend, staring into my own eyes that looked back with a familiar mix of hope and hesitation, pupils dilating like black holes swallowing light. "This year," I declared, the words ringing clearer than I expected in the empty room, slicing through the silence like a blade through flesh. "I resolve to be bolder, to stop holding back, to finally live like I mean it, no more second-guessing, no more playing small." It felt cathartic, a verbal contract with myself sealed in alcohol's fire, and I chuckled at the dramatics, draining the glass before shuffling to bed, the mirror's surface seeming to ripple faintly in my peripheral vision as I turned away, though I blamed it on the alcohol's haze, ignoring the way the vines in the frame seemed to tighten like veins bulging under strain. I woke up the next morning with only a mild headache, the kind that coffee could chase away with its bitter embrace, but an odd undercurrent lingered, a subtle shift in the air like the pressure change before a storm that makes your sinuses ache and your instincts prickle with unnamed dread, making colors seem brighter and decisions less daunting, as if the world had tilted slightly on its axis overnight. The apartment looked unchanged, same cluttered kitchen counter with Sarah's half-read novel splayed open like a gutted animal, pages fluttering in the draft, same stack of unopened mail by the door threatening to topple like a house of cards built on lies. But when I glanced in the bathroom mirror while brushing my teeth, my reflection held the smile a fraction longer than I did, as if savoring the expression, testing its weight against the pull of gravity or some darker force. I blinked, attributing it to residual grogginess or the play of morning light filtering through grimy windows, and proceeded with the day. But things unfolded differently from the start. At work, I pitched an innovative feature for our app that I'd been mulling over for months but never voiced, fearing rejection or ridicule from colleagues whose opinions I'd elevated to judgment thrones. And it landed with applause from the team, my boss nodding approvingly as if I'd always been this assertive, his eyes narrowing slightly in appraisal that felt like the first cut of a scalpel. Sarah texted about weekend plans, and my replies flowed with uncharacteristic flair, suggestive, adventurous, proposing a spontaneous road trip instead of our usual Netflix binge that had become a rut of passive consumption. And she responded with excited emojis, calling it refreshing, though I detected a note of surprise in her voice when she called later, as if peering into a familiar room where the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. By the end of that first week, I'd booked us a last-minute cabin getaway in the mountains, the kind where isolation amplifies every whisper and creak, closed a tricky client deal with bold negotiations I'd previously shied from, demanding terms that bordered on aggressive and watching the other side squirm like worms on hooks, and even confronted a longtime friend about unpaid loans without the usual awkward hedging, my words slicing through excuses until he paled, promising repayment with a stammer that tasted like victory laced with ash. It felt incredible, like shedding an invisible weight that had pinned me down for so long, my actions aligning with intentions in a seamless flow that left me energized rather than drained. But beneath the exhilaration lurked a faint disquiet, a whisper that this surge wasn't entirely mine, like borrowing power from a source that demanded repayment in blood. The changes kept accelerating, building momentum like a snowball rolling downhill, gathering size and speed until it threatened to bury everything in its path, crushing bones and dreams alike under its inexorable weight. Though at first I reveled in the transformation, attributing it to the resolution's psychological boost rather than anything sinister lurking beneath, a cancer metastasizing in the marrow of my soul. I started saying yes to opportunities I'd once dismissed as too risky, investing a chunk of my modest inheritance in volatile stocks that paid off handsomely at first, the markets up swinging like a pendulum that could decapitate the unwary, joining a public speaking club where I delivered impromptu talks with charisma I didn't know I possessed, words flowing like venom from a serpent's fangs, captivating audiences who hung on every syllable while I felt a detached thrill, as if watching myself from afar. Sarah noticed the shift immediately, her initial delight tinged with concern as the months wore on. "You seem so different," she'd say over dinner. Her fork paused midair, eyes searching mine for the familiar caution that had defined me, but I'd brush it off with a laugh, pulling her close and whispering how this was the real me emerging, unburdened and alive, my hands lingering on her waist with a possessiveness that bordered on bruising, though she didn't complain at first, mistaking it for passion. Our relationship deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. The sex, more passionate, almost frantic, bodies colliding with an urgency that left marks like battle scars. Conversations more raw but edged with barbs that drew blood when tempers flared, but cracks appeared subtly, like hairline fractures in glass under pressure that spiderweb outward until the whole shatters in a cascade of sharp regret. Arguments flared hotter when I pushed boundaries she wasn't ready for, like quitting my stable job impulsively for a high-stakes freelance venture that promised freedom but delivered instability, nights where bills piled like accusations and her tears fell like rain on barren soil. Friends adapted or drifted, some alienated by my newfound bluntness that cut like a scalpel through social niceties, leaving relationships bleeding out, others drawn in by the magnetic pull but wary of the edge it carried, a sharpness that cut when least expected, slicing through loyalties until isolation crept in like gangrene. And always, the mirrors nagged at the periphery, reflections in store windows seeming to move with too much independence, lingering on passers-by with predatory interest, phone screens capturing eyes that gleamed with an intelligence not quite my own, pupils contracting like apertures in a camera, focusing on prey, turning ordinary glances into moments of unease that I dismissed as paranoia born of stress, though the chill they left lingered like the touch of a corpse's hand. It peaked one stifling night in late December 2017, almost a year to the day from that fateful resolution, when the air hung heavy with unspoken tensions, and Sarah had retired early to bed after another heated discussion about my latest gamble. A sizable loan taken against our future home for a business idea that thrilled me but terrified her, her voice breaking as she begged me to consider the consequences, tears streaking her cheeks like rivulets of blood from invisible wounds. I couldn't sleep, the apartment's silence oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of traffic like the growl of approaching beasts and the occasional creak of settling beams that sounded like bones grinding in sockets. So I wandered to the living room, scotch in hand again as if retracing steps to invoke some ritual of clarity, the liquid burning down my throat like molten lead forging chains I couldn't see. The mahogany mirror loomed in the lamplight, its frame casting twisted shadows that danced like fingers reaching for the edges of the room, clawing at the wallpaper as if trying to tear through to the rot beneath, and I stood before it, studying my face. The sharper jawline from stress-induced weight loss, cheekbones protruding like blades under taut skin, the eyes that held a fire I barely recognized, flickering like embers in a dying pyre. I tilted my head experimentally. The reflection tilted a beat late, as if deciding whether to comply or defy, its movement fluid yet deliberate, like a predator feigning submission. I raised a hand to touch my cheek. It raised the opposite, fingers lingering in midair with deliberate slowness, nails elongated slightly in the distortion, curving like talons ready to rend. Then, as my breath caught in a strangled gasp, it smiled when I didn't. A slow, predatory curl of lips that revealed too many teeth, gums receding in the warp to expose roots like exposed nerves, eyes narrowing with amusement at my dawning horror, the whites yellowed as if jaundiced from internal decay. I backed away, the glass of scotch slipping from numb fingers to shatter on the floor, amber liquid spreading like blood pooling from a fresh wound, shards glinting like broken promises under the light. I bolted to the bedroom, heart hammering against ribs like a caged animal desperate for escape, its claws scraping against bars until flesh tears and blood slicks the enclosure, shaking Sarah awake with frantic whispers about nightmares bleeding into waking life, her skin clammy under my touch as if already cooling in death's embrace. But she soothed me back to sleep with murmured reassurances, her warmth a temporary anchor against the tide of dread swelling inside me like a tumor expanding to crush vital organs. The next morning, I laughed it off over coffee, blaming exhaustion and too much screen time that fried synapses like overcooked nerves, but the fear took root, sprouting tendrils that wrapped around every glance at reflective surfaces. Car windows where reflections leered with independent malice, polished appliances distorting faces into grotesque masks, even puddles on rain-slicked streets rippling with submerged horrors that surfaced when disturbed, each one a potential gateway to whatever entity had stirred in that antique glass, a yawning maw hungry for more than just my boldness. The New Year's Eve arrived with forced festivity. We hosted a small party at the apartment, friends toasting the year's successes with clinking glasses and laughter that rang hollow in my ears like the cackles of hyenas over a fresh kill, my eyes darting to avoid the mirror shrouded under a throw blanket in the corner, its shape bulging like a corpse under a sheet. But around 11:58, alone in the kitchen grabbing ice amid the countdown's building frenzy, the chance of numbers descending like a sentence being read, I passed a polished cabinet door, its surface catching the light just enough to reflect, the image warping as if the metal was melting from internal heat. The image wasn't mimicking the room anymore. It stood in a shadowy void, arms crossed over a chest that heaved with labored breaths, watching with patient malice, skin sallow and stretched tight over bones that protruded like threats. As the crowd chanted, 10, 9, 8, outside, their voices distorting into a choral howl, it mouthed words I deciphered with chilling certainty. Time's up, its lips peeling back to reveal teeth filed to points, tongue flicking out like a serpent tasting the air for fear. At the stroke of midnight, a searing fire ignited in my veins, spreading like liquid lightning from core to extremities, cauterizing nerves as it went, vision blurring into white-hot static laced with red veins like bursting capillaries. I gripped the counter, knuckles whitening until skin split, blood trickling in warm rivulets, my body seizing in convulsions that arched my back like a bowstring drawn to breaking, muscles tearing with the strain. When clarity returned, I was still standing there, but profoundly wrong, my limbs moving with alien precision, fingers flexing as if testing the fit of stolen gloves. I tried to scream, to call for Sarah. Nothing emerged but a calm exhale, the sound hollow like wind through a skull's empty sockets. Inside, panic erupted like a dam breaking, flooding every thought with terror as I realized the horrifying truth. I couldn't control anything anymore, my will a caged bird fluttering against bars while the thief paraded in my feathers. The reflection, in my body now, turned to the cabinet's surface, smiled at the real me trapped behind the glass, eyes gleaming with triumphant malice that burned like acid on exposed flesh, and walked away casually, rejoining the party as if nothing had transpired, his laughter mingling seamlessly with the cheers, a counterfeit joy that masked the rot festering beneath. That's when the full nightmare crystallized, the pieces slotting into place with merciless precision that sliced through my denial like a vivisectionist's blade. The mirror wasn't merely antique or quirky. It was a conduit, a cursed artifact that had listened to my ill-fated resolution, granting it by summoning or awakening the bolder version of myself that dwelled in the reflective realm, the one unencumbered by my fears and doubts, swapping us at the year's turnover to fulfill the wish in the most literal, twisted sense, a Faustian bargain sealed in blood I hadn't spilled yet but would pay for in endless installments of suffering. But boldness without the tempering of caution proved a double-edged blade, honing into something sharper, more dangerous, as he wielded my life with reckless abandon, amplifying every impulse I'd suppressed until it warped into excess that devoured everything in its path like a cancer metastasizing unchecked. From inside the glass, I became a silent spectator, my existence confined to whatever reflective surfaces he deigned to face. Bathroom mirrors during morning routines where I'd watch him shave with deliberate strokes that nicked skin just to watch blood bead. Car rear views on drives where roadkill smeared the bumper like omens. Even phone screens during video calls where Noah's innocent face filled the frame, my pleas silent as I pounded against the digital barrier, my presence invisible to all but him, who occasionally glanced with a knowing smirk, acknowledging my torment as fuel for his conquests, his eyes reflecting back the agony he inflicted, as if savoring its flavor on his tongue. The early months were a blur of helpless rage, watching as he lived my life in hyperdrive, proposing to Sarah with an extravagant gesture on a rented yacht under a sky bleeding sunset colors like open wounds, her yes ringing out amid fireworks he'd arranged that exploded like bursting organs. Though I saw the flicker of hesitation in her eyes that he ignored, pressing forward with a kiss that bruised her lips. He quit the startup for a venture capital gig, charming investors with pitches I'd never have dared, raking in deals that ballooned our bank account but introduced volatilities I'd have hedged against. His negotiations ruthless, leaving counterparts pale and shaking as if he'd drained their life force. Friends were cold or cultivated based on utility, loyal ones who questioned his shifts distanced with subtle manipulations that spread rumors like viruses, ruining reputations until they withered in isolation. New allies drawn in by his magnetic pull, but wary of the edge it carried, eventually discarded when their usefulness expired, left broken in ways that echoed my own confinement. Sarah adapted at first, dazzled by the whirlwind of luxury and excitement, but strains emerged. Late nights excused as networking that reeked of other perfumes and carried the scent of sweat-soaked betrayal. Arguments where his words cut hotter, leaving her curled in fetal positions on the floor, sobbing as bruises bloomed like dark flowers on her pale skin. They married in 2019. A lavish affair in the mountains with vows he delivered with theatrical flair, guests toasting under chandeliers that dripped light like melting flesh. But I saw the shadows under her eyes, the forced smile as her hand trembled signing the register, a union sealed in ink that might as well have been blood. Noah arrived in 2021, a squalling bundle of joy that briefly softened even his edges, the delivery room filled with her screams as forceps tore tissue in a graphic birth he filmed for memories. But fatherhood became another arena for dominance, rigid schedules enforced with slaps that left red imprints on tiny limbs, high expectations imposed on an infant who cried not from hunger but fear. Sarah's gentle protests dismissed as overprotectiveness, her interventions met with shoves that sent her sprawling, head-cracking against furniture with sickening thuds. Each New Year's Eve brought the ritualistic tug, a cosmic deadline where the swap threatened reversal if not managed. The air thickening with electric tension as midnight neared, reflections rippling like skin under boils ready to burst. He felt it too, the pull intensifying as if invisible hooks embedded in flesh yanked toward the glass. A vertigo that made reflections waver and bleed colors at the edges. The first year, 2018, he panicked slightly, avoiding mirrors entirely, smashing smaller ones in fits that left shards embedded in his palms like self-inflicted stigmata, but the energy built regardless, forcing him to confront the mahogany piece in isolation, waiting out the stroke as I surged briefly, tasting freedom in the body for seconds, fingers flexing with real sensation, lungs filling with unfiltered air, before he wrested back control with a snarl, his will crushing mine like a boot on a skull. By 2019, he'd researched dark web forums where users traded tales of cursed artifacts amid images of self-mutilation for release. Antique dealers whispering of the mirror's origins in 18th century alchemy, a tool for essence exchange, crafted by a reclusive occultist who ended his days gibbering in asylums, skin etched with symbols that wept pus. He bought this remote cabin that year, a dilapidated structure deep in Pisgah National Forest, its foundations sunk into soil rich with unmarked graves from logging accidents long forgotten. Driving here alone on December 31st with the mirror shrouded in the trunk like a bound corpse, locking himself in the basement he'd renovated into a fortress. Reinforced concrete walls poured thick to muffle screams, no windows to leak light or reflections that could betray the ritual, one heavy steel door bolted from inside with locks that clicked like cocking guns. He'd placed the mirror facing a blank corner, endure the midnight surge and darkness that pressed like thumbs on eyeballs, emerging victorious as the new year dawned, my fleeting embodiment crushed under his will, leaving me to claw at the glass in futile rage as he drove away laughing. The basement evolved into my perpetual prison after that initial trial, a meticulously designed hell where he could contain the annual threat without risk, expanding it over visits with cruel efficiency that turned the space into a chamber of horrors tailored to break the spirit bit by bit. Thick, shatterproof glass panels encasing a central chamber around the mirror, allowing him to observe me like a specimen in a jar under clinical lights that buzzed like swarms of flies over decaying meat. My movements confined to the reflective plane while he taunted from outside, sometimes pressing faces against the glass to mimic my despair with exaggerated grimaces that stretched skin to tearing points. A narrow slot for sliding in trays of bland food, canned beans swimming in congealed grease that slithered down my throat like living things, stale bread molded at edges that I ate anyway to stave off the gnawing hunger that twisted guts into knots, water in plastic bottles tainted with a metallic tang that evoked blood, enough to sustain but never satisfy, the monotony grinding down resolve like sandpaper on bone, leaving raw patches where hope once resided. He added amenities in mocking increments. A thin cot bolted to the floor for uneasy sleep plagued by dreams of evisceration. Dog-eared paperbacks with pages torn out at climaxes to deny resolution. A battery-powered radio tuned only to static channels that occasionally crackled with phantom voices I strained to decipher, hoping for connection, but finding only echoes of my isolation that morphed into accusations, whispering of my failures until I bashed the device against walls in fits that left knuckles pulped. Visits came monthly at first, then sporadically as his life accelerated into chaos, each one a session of psychological vivisection. He'd pin photos to the outer glass. Noah's first steps captured on phone cameras I'd never hold. The boy's tiny feet leaving bloody prints in my hallucinations. Sarah's weary smiles at family gatherings masking the welts beneath her clothes. His own accolades from ventures that teetered on ethical edges, stained with the metaphorical blood of ruined lives, narrating with glee how he'd improved on my blueprint, turning potential into empire while I withered in obscurity, his voice dripping with venom that corroded my remaining sanity like acid on flesh. The horror deepened in its subtlety, not just the overt cruelties but the insidious erosion of self, years blending into a timeless haze where days were marked only by the faint shift of light through a high vent he sometimes boarded up for punishment, plunging me into darkness so absolute it felt like being buried alive, soil pressing against eyelids and filling nostrils with the scent of earthworms and decay. I screamed until my throat rawed to shreds, blood-flecking lips as vocal cords tore, pounded fists against unyielding glass until knuckles split open, exposing bone that gleamed white before phantom healing reset the cycle, my form ethereal yet capable of simulated pain that lingered like ghosts of sensation, nerves firing eternally in loops of agony. Dreams invaded waking hours, vivid hallucinations of freedom, walking hand in hand with Sarah through autumn leaves that crumbled to dust at touch, cradling Noah as he babbled first words that morphed into accusations of abandonment, only to shatter upon awareness, leaving me hollowed, questioning if any of it had ever been real, or if I was the construct, the flawed original discarded for a superior iteration, my essence leaking away like pus from an infected wound. The mirror became both tormentor and confidant, my reflection now his, mocking with expressions I couldn't mimic, whispering silent taunts that burrowed into my psyche like maggots in rotting meat. You were always the weak one. I'm what you could have been without the cowardice. Its lips moving in slow motion, teeth gnashing as if chewing on my despair. Isolation bred madness in increments, counting cracks in the concrete, 73, then 80 as humidity warped the walls, each new fissure like a vein bursting under pressure. Reciting childhood memories aloud to anchor identity, but details faded, faces blurring until Sarah's smile became an abstract warmth distorted by tears. Noah's cries a distant echo I clung to, like a lifeline fraying thread by thread, snapping one fiber at a time until I dangled over the abyss. But over the interminable stretch, something unforeseen transpired. As the rage that fueled my early resistance burned out into embers, smothered by the weight of endless nights where solitude pressed like a vice on the skull, a quiet acceptance took root, nourished by the glimpses of life continuing beyond my cage, fragmented views through his careless reflections that offered bittersweet sustenance. Watching Noah grow, from chubby toddler with rolls of flesh that dimpled like fresh graves, to curious boy with my eyes but his father's bold stride, his laughter captured in videos where he'd fall and skin knees, blood welling in crimson beads that he licked curiously, stirred not just envy but a perverse paternal pride, knowing that in some twisted way, my sacrifice had enabled his existence, his joys blooming from the soil fertilized by my decay. Sarah's resilience, enduring his volatilities with grace I admired from afar, her body bearing the marks of his affections, faded scars from cigarette burns disguised as accidents, ribs cracked from playful shoves, humanized her anew, her quiet strengths a beacon in my darkness, though the sight of her cowering in corners, makeup running in black streams like ink from a slashed throat, haunted me more than any phantom. The bitterness ebbed, replaced by a stoic calm, a meditative detachment where I observed without attachment, finding solace in the rhythm of their lives even as mine stagnated in a pool of its own filth. Days when he'd forget the bucket, and I'd soil myself, the stench clinging like a second skin, humiliating in its intimacy. He changed inversely, the boldness curdling under the weight of unchecked impulses like milk souring in heat, turning toxic and clotted, risks escalating to recklessness that left financial ruins in wake, charm devolving into coercion that manipulated allies into broken shells, his visits laced with paranoia as if my growing serenity leached into him, diluting his edge with echoes of my old caution, manifesting in tremors that shook his hands like withdrawal from a drug he couldn't quit. Photos showed the toll. Sarah's eyes hollowed by unspoken fears, sockets bruised purple from sleepless nights punctuated by his rages, Noah's laughter rarer, replaced by flinches at raised voices that echoed the slaps landing on tender flesh. He drank heavily now, bottles shattering against walls in fits that left glass embedded in feet, blood trailing like accusations, raged at invisible slights that he blamed on my influence, his face contorted in mirrors like a demon possessing its host, veins bulging like worms under skin. Last month he arrived unannounced, reeking of bourbon and defeat, waving crumpled divorce papers Sarah had served, ink smeared with her tears, custody hearings looming like guillotines ready to sever family ties. "Your fault," he snarled through the glass, spittle flecking his lips like foam from a rabid dog, eyes bloodshot and wild with capillaries burst like fireworks of madness. "Your weakness bleeding back, holding me down like chains I can't shake, rotting me from the inside until I puke up your cowardice." In a frenzy, he tore down the pinned mementos, shredding images of Noah's birthdays into confetti that fluttered like dying dreams, fingernails ripping paper with such force they bled, droplets spattering the glass like abstract art of violence, vowing to end the cycle permanently with methods that curdled my blood, strangulation wires, acid baths, vivisections performed while conscious. Yesterday, New Year's Eve, he stumbled into the basement drunker than ever, lugging a duffel of improvised explosives, wires tangled like intestines, timers ticking like hearts on the verge of arrest, cans of accelerant sloshing with the promise of inferno, muttering incoherently about severing the link once and for all, rigging a blast to trigger minutes after midnight, obliterating the mirror and me in a fiery purge that would free him from the annual tug, his hands fumbling with connections that sparked like synapses firing in a dying brain. He worked sloppily, tools slipping from trembling fingers slick with sweat and blood from self-inflicted cuts, brushing the glass repeatedly as he set connections, each contact sending jolts through our shared essence, the boundary thinning as midnight approached, the air thickening with the stench of his unwashed body and the metallic tang of fear sweat. That inadvertent proximity, skin-grazing mirror in his inebriated haze, leaving smears of grime and blood like sacrificial offerings, jarred the equilibrium, a fleeting window where the link flickered vulnerable, raw and exposed like flayed nerves. I felt the surge, reached mentally across the divide, drawing on the calm I'd forged in isolation against his chaotic storm, visualizing our polarities as magnets inexorably drawn, the pull magnetic yet repulsive, like flesh melding in a grotesque fusion. His hand spasmed under my influence, mine in spirit seized partial command. We wrestled through the body. He smashed fists into walls in blind fury, bones cracking with audible snaps that sent shards of plaster flying like teeth from a punched mouth, while I redirected limbs toward the mirror, forcing proximity amid his howls that echoed like tortured souls in purgatory. He convulsed, body thrashing as internal war raged, organs straining against ribs that threatened to splinter, but I pressed the glass to his chest, his face, until the swap ignited early, expelling him into the reflection with a psychic wrench that tore through us both like a blade eviscerating guts, leaving me gasping in the flesh, control mine for the first time in years, the basement reeking of vomit and blood from his thrashing. Now I'm out, body trembling with disuse, muscles atrophied from proxy existence but alive in the tangible world where every sensation, the rough grain of wooden floors underfoot scraping against calluses formed from pacing concrete, the bite of cold air seeping through cracks like fingers probing wounds, feels amplified to excruciating vividness, pain blooming like flowers of fire in nerves long dormant. He's down there, pounding with renewed savagery, the dresser shuddering as splinters fly like projectiles from exploding flesh, his voice a guttural roar promising atrocities. I'll make you watch as I take them apart, piece by piece, starting with the boy, your precious echo, snapping his spine like kindling while he screams for a daddy who failed him, then turning to Sarah, carving out her eyes so she can't see the end coming, her blood painting the walls in patterns of your betrayal. The timer's disarmed, wires yanked in haste with hands slick from his blood, but the door won't hold forever. Midnight looms, the annual pivot where power could flip again if unresolved, the air thickening with anticipation like the moment before a blade falls. I could smash the mirror now, wield the hammer from his toolkit and reduce it to shards, ending us both in a cascade of glass and finality. Quick, irrevocable, the fragments embedding in skin like 1,000 accusatory eyes, sparing the world his poison at the cost of my erasure, my essence dissipating like smoke from charred remains. But Noah. The thought of him fatherless, adrift in a world without even the flawed guardian he knows, twists like a knife in the gut, eviscerating from within, and Sarah deserving truth, not absence, her body perhaps already marked by his final rage, limbs broken in prelude to worse. Or perhaps another resolution, spoken at the witching hour to rebind the curse. Words to seal him away in eternal torment, restore balance by inverting the swap permanently, or unravel the enchantment entirely, the vines on the frame withering like desiccated flesh as the glass clouds over with the breath of released souls. The pounding intensifies, wood fracturing audibly now like ribs giving way under pressure, his escape imminent, fingers perhaps already pushing through gaps, bloody and bent. Any ideas? Please. I want to go home, to hold Noah for real amid the wreckage of what he's endured, to whisper apologies to Sarah's ear as I tend her wounds. But if not, at least let my end mean something. His containment in a hell of his own making, their safety from the monster I unleashed, even if it costs my flesh rendered to ribbons in the process. My New Year's resolution was to survive. I used to take these trips every year around the holidays, not chasing warm beaches or bustling cities or even some quiet retreat to recharge after the chaos of December, but heading straight into places where groups of people were convinced the world was on the brink of ending, gathering in remote spots to wait for whatever cataclysm they'd prophesied, whether it was divine judgment raining down from the skies or some cosmic reset wiping the slate clean of humanity's messes. It wasn't about mocking them or feeling superior. There was something strangely compelling about standing on the edge with folks who'd bet everything on a single midnight moment, their eyes wide with a mix of terror and hope as the clock ticked down, and then watching the quiet disappointment settle in when nothing happened, the sun rising the next day like it always did, indifferent to their shattered certainties. For me, it started as a way to scratch an itch that formed back in the late 90s when I was neck-deep in the IT world, caught up in the frenzy over Y2K, that massive wave of speculation where everyone from corporate suits to everyday folks was terrified that computers, those silent overlords already dictating so much of our daily grind, would interpret the rollover from 1999 to 2000 as a jump back to 1900, triggering chain reactions of failures that could black out cities, crash economies, or worse, send missiles launching on autopilot or hospital machines flatlining mid-surgery. I remember the long nights in dimly lit server rooms, surrounded by humming racks of equipment, poring over lines of code that suddenly felt like ticking bombs, my colleagues and I debating whether the threat was real or just a clever scare tactic to drum up billions in consulting fees. But we all kept our heads down and billed the hours anyway, because who wants to be the one guy saying the emperor has no clothes when the checks are clearing and the bonuses are stacking up? In the end, of course, the millennium flipped without much fanfare. A few scattered glitches and outdated systems, some ATMs spitting out funny dates or traffic lights blinking out of sync, but no global meltdown, no planes tumbling from the clouds like wounded birds, no power grids plunging entire continents into primordial darkness where people would revert to scavenging in the ruins. The world shrugged it off. People nursed their hangovers and made half-hearted promises to hit the gym or eat better, and life lumbered on as if the whole thing had been a collective bad dream we'd all woken from at once. I came out of it with a fat bank account, padded by all those overtime shifts and emergency contracts, but also this lingering sense of disillusionment that stuck to me like a bad aftertaste, making me question the shiny future I'd bought into, where technology was supposed to solve everything, but instead seemed to amplify our worst fears, turning abstract bugs into apocalyptic bogeymen that kept us up at night. I walked away from the corporate grind not long after, invested wisely in some index funds and real estate that ticked along steadily without demanding my soul, and took on freelance gigs here and there to keep the lights on, living simply in a modest condo where the only extravagance was a decent coffee maker and a shelf of books on history's forgotten panics. But the real indulgence, the thing that got my blood pumping each winter, was these trips, chasing down the next predicted doomsday, embedding myself with groups who'd pinpointed a specific date for the end, often tied to New Year's Eve for that poetic symmetry of old giving way to new, or in their case, to nothing at all. It began innocently enough with some reading about past scares, like how folks in the year 1000 huddled in churches waiting for the second coming, or the great disappointment in 1844 when thousands sold their possessions and climbed hills to meet Jesus, only to trudge home empty-handed and heartbroken, their faith cracked, but not always broken. I devoured accounts of these events, the psychology behind them fascinating me, the way charismatic leaders could weave biblical verses or astrological alignments into ironclad proofs, convincing ordinary people to uproot their lives, abandon families, or worse, take drastic steps to prepare their souls, all for a deadline that inevitably passed without incident, leaving behind shattered communities and quiet suicides in the aftermath. There was a dark allure to it, this cycle of build-up and letdown, and before long I was planning my first trip, heading to a remote farm in the Midwest where a small sect believed a comet would strike at midnight on a forgotten New Year's, standing with them under starry skies as they chanted and prayed, their faces upturned in eerie anticipation, only for the hours to slip by uneventfully, the group dispersing in muted confusion while I slipped away with a story that felt more real than any vacation photo album. Over the years, the trips evolved into this odd tradition, each one a little more immersive than the last, pulling me into corners of the world where rationality gave way to fervent belief, places off the grid where cell signals died and the only light at night came from campfires or lanterns, casting flickering shadows that made everyone look a bit unhinged. I've shivered on windswept cliffs in Ireland with druid-inspired folks convinced ancient gods would reclaim the earth at the turn of the year, their robes whipping in the gale as they intoned spells in languages long dead, the salt spray stinging my eyes while I wondered if hypothermia might claim us before any deity did. I've sat in sweltering tents in the Australian outback, sweat soaking through my clothes as a group fasted and meditated, waiting for a planetary alignment to trigger global quakes, their bodies weakening day by day until some collapsed from dehydration, murmuring about visions that sounded more like delirium than divine insight. One particularly memorable year found me in a forgotten village in rural Mexico, huddled in a crumbling church with locals who blended Catholic rites with indigenous prophecies, burning incense that choked the air and induced headaches, their prayers rising in a cacophony as midnight neared, only for the bell to toll harmlessly and the congregation to file out in silence, some weeping quietly while others shrugged it off with forced smiles, already rationalizing why the end had been postponed yet again. There was always this undercurrent of dread mixed with exhilaration, the slow build of tension as the date approached, conversations turning more intense, personal confessions spilling out under the pressure of impending finality. Stories of lost loves, regrets, hidden shames that people unburdened themselves of, thinking it wouldn't matter soon. And when nothing happened, that deflated aftermath was almost as captivating. The awkward readjustments, the leaders scrambling to explain the miscalculation, promising a revised date that kept the faithful hooked a little longer. I never mocked them. If anything, I envied their certainty, that ability to surrender to something bigger, even if it was illusion, while I floated on the periphery, observing like a ghost at the feast, heading home each time with a notebook full of details and a quiet satisfaction that the world had endured another false alarm. This past year, though, it all went sideways in ways I still wake up sweating from. The kind of experience that makes you question if some of those prophecies weren't so far off after all. Or at least if there are pockets of the world where the end has already come quietly, without fanfare, leaving behind something worse than oblivion. The lead came from an obscure online forum I'd been lurking on for years, a niche corner of the web where doomsday enthusiasts traded tips on upcoming dates, debating interpretations of ancient texts or modern omens with the fervor of stock traders analyzing market trends. Someone posted about a small community in the Welsh countryside, not far from the border with England, a place called Llanfair or something similarly unpronounceable, where a reclusive group had been quietly preparing for what they called the Great Unveiling at midnight on December 31st. The details were sparse. No flashy website or recruitment drives, just whispers of an old estate turned commune, inhabitants shunning technology and outsiders, believing that as the year turned, a veil would lift, exposing the true nature of reality and sweeping away the unworthy in a wave of silent dissolution, their bodies unraveling like thread from a spool until only purified souls remained. It sounded poetic, almost serene compared to the fiery spectacles of other groups, and the isolation appealed to me. No crowds, just a handful of devoted folks in a misty valley, waiting for the end with quiet dignity. I booked a train ticket, packed light with warm layers and a thermos, and set off a few days before New Year's, the journey taking me through increasingly rural landscapes where fields stretched gray under overcast skies, villages thinning out until the stations were little more than platforms with rusted benches, the air growing heavier with the promise of rain. The weather turned nasty as I arrived, a persistent drizzle that soaked through my coat before I'd even left the tiny station, the kind of cold wet that seeps into your marrow and makes every step a slog, wind whipping off the hills like it had a personal grudge. I'd tried arranging a ride in advance, emailing a contact from the forum who claimed loose ties to the group, but responses were curt and evasive, warning that true seekers find their own path, which I took as code for no taxis or easy access. Sure enough, when I asked at the station's lone ticket window, the attendant, an older woman with a face creased like old leather, shook her head firmly, muttering about those folk up the valley and how no local would drive there after dark, her eyes darting nervously as if saying the name might summon something unwelcome. I shrugged it off as typical small-town superstition, the kind I'd encountered before where outsiders viewed these groups with a mix of fear and disdain, labeling them cults or worse, and set out on foot, following vague directions scribbled from online maps, the path winding uphill through sodden fields where sheep huddled miserably under bare trees, their bleats sounding like distant cries for help. It took hours, the light fading early under the heavy clouds, my boots caked in mud that pulled with each step like hands grasping from below, cold rain trickling down my collar and pooling in my socks until blisters formed, raw and stinging. By the time I crested the hill and spotted the cluster of low stone buildings nestled in the glen below, night had fallen fully, the only illumination a faint glow from windows that flickered like dying embers, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, almost metallic, like rust or blood carried on the wind. I approached the nearest cottage, its door weathered and unpainted, knocking firmly despite the exhaustion weighing on me like a sodden blanket, desperate for warmth and a place to dry out before whatever rituals unfolded the next night. No answer at first, just the patter of rain on slate roofs and the distant lowing of livestock. But then the door eased open with a creak that echoed unnaturally loud, revealing a woman in her 40s, her face pale and gaunt under a simple wool shawl, eyes deep set and shadowed as if sleep was a stranger. She regarded me silently for a moment, rain dripping from the eaves onto my shoulders, then stepped aside with a nod, gesturing me in without a word, the interior dim and stuffy, lit by a single oil lamp that cast wavering shadows across rough plaster walls yellowed with age and smoke. The air inside was heavy, cloying with the smell of herbs, rosemary maybe, or thyme, mixed with something earthier, like turned soil or decaying leaves, and as she led me to a small hearth where a peat fire smoldered weakly, I felt a prickle of unease that I chalked up to fatigue and the chill. She offered no name, no questions about my journey or intentions, just handed me a rough towel and a mug of steaming tea that tasted bitter, medicinal, coating my tongue with a film that lingered unpleasantly. I sipped it gratefully anyway, warming my hands on the ceramic as she watched from across the room, her expression serene but distant, like someone already halfway gone from this world. After a while, she showed me to a spare room upstairs, a narrow space with a sagging bed and a single blanket that smelled faintly of mildew, wishing me rest in a voice soft and monotone, her eyes never quite meeting mine as she closed the door with a click that sounded final. I slept fitfully that night, dreams fragmented and disturbing, visions of soil churning under my feet, hands emerging pale and grasping, pulling me down into darkness that smelled of rot and regret, and woke to gray light filtering through a grimy window, my head throbbing faintly as if the tea had left a residue. The cottage was quiet, no sounds of movement below, and when I descended the creaky stairs, the woman was gone. The fire banked low, a simple breakfast of porridge and bread left on the table with a note scribbled in shaky hand. "Join us at dusk in the glen. Prepare your spirit." I ate mechanically, the food bland and heavy in my stomach, then ventured outside. The rain eased to a mist that hung low over the ground, obscuring the surrounding hills like a shroud. The cluster of cottages, maybe 8 or 9 in total, looked even more desolate in daylight, stones moss-covered and crumbling, roofs sagging under unseen weight, no signs of life beyond a thin plume of smoke from one chimney farther down. I wandered between them, knocking tentatively on doors, but responses were sparse. A few opened to reveal inhabitants much like my host, pale and quiet, offering vague smiles and murmured welcomes without inviting further conversation, their skin waxy under the overcast sky, eyes dull as if gazing inward at some private revelation. One older man, his hands trembling as he clutched a worn book, spoke briefly of the unveiling, describing it in hushed tones as a moment when the false world would slough away like dead skin, revealing the true form beneath, his words accompanied by a cough that rattled wetly in his chest, flecks of something dark staining his lips. As the day wore on, the unease built slowly, a creeping dread that started in my gut and spread like the mist enveloping the glen, making every shadow seem deeper, every silence heavier. I noticed details that nagged at first, then horrified, the way their movements were labored, joints creaking audibly like old hinges, breaths shallow and ragged as if air was a burden, skin not just pale but mottled in places, faint bruises blooming under collars or cuffs like ink stains spreading on paper, and the smell, that underlying earthiness I'd caught before, stronger now, like damp soil turned after rain, mixed with a faint sweetness that turned my stomach, reminiscent of overripe fruit left to ferment. In one cottage where a woman invited me for tea, bitter again, leaves floating like debris in murky water, she spoke of preparation, of cleansing the body to ease the transition, her voice fading as she coughed, a deep, hacking sound that brought up phlegm speckled with blood, which she wiped away casually with a rag already stained rust brown. I asked about their beliefs, probing gently as always, but answers were evasive, circling back to the midnight hour when all would be revealed, their eyes lighting with a feverish gleam that made my skin prickle, as if they pitied my ignorance or envied my skepticism. By afternoon, more emerged from their homes, gathering in small groups to whisper prayers or share meals of sparse, flavorless food, boiled roots and thin gruel that slid down throats with difficulty, some chewing mechanically while others seemed to force it, gagging slightly as if the act was more ritual than nourishment. I joined tentatively, listening to stories of how they'd found this place, drawn by dreams or signs, abandoning lives marred by illness or loss, seeking renewal in the unveiling, and noticed how many bore scars or deformities hidden under clothes. glimpses of bandaged limbs or discolored patches that wept fluid, the air thickening with that sweet rot scent until it coated my throat like syrup. Dusk fell early, the mist thickening into fog that muffled sounds and blurred edges, turning the glen into a ghostly limbo where figures moved like specters, their forms dissolving at distances. They led me to a central clearing, ringed by ancient oaks twisted by wind into shapes that loomed like tortured souls, bark split and oozing sap that gleamed darkly. We formed a loose circle, perhaps 20 in total, hands linking in a chain that felt clammy and limp, pulses faint under cold skin. The leader, an elderly woman with hollow cheeks and eyes sunk deep in sockets, her breath wheezing like wind through cracked pipes, began a chant, low and rhythmic, words in a language that twisted unfamiliar on the tongue, invoking release from the false vessel and embrace of the true form. As midnight neared, the air grew heavier, the fog swirling with the herbal smoke from braziers they'd lit, fumes that made my head swim and vision blur, the bitterness of the tea returning to my palate like a warning. Then it began, not with drama, but a quiet horror that unfolded like a flower blooming in reverse, petals folding inward to reveal a rotten core. One man sighed deeply, his grip slackening as his body sagged, skin paling to a sickly gray that spread like ink in water, veins darkening under the surface as if blood curdled within. A woman beside him smiled faintly, eyes glazing over with a film like cataracts forming in seconds, her flesh softening, sagging from bones with a wet, shifting sound that turned my stomach. Murmurs rippled through the circle, not of panic, but acceptance, bodies collapsing one by one with soft thuds to the damp earth, limbs twitching in agonal spasms, faces frozen in eerie rapture as fluids leaked from orifices, dark bile from mouths, urine-soaking pants, the stench rising sharp and acrid, mingling with the herbs into a nauseating miasma that cloyed in my nostrils. The leader continued chanting, her voice cracking as her own skin blistered and peeled in patches, revealing raw, weeping tissue beneath, blood welling in sluggish drops that pattered to the ground like rain from a leaking corpse. I realized with mounting terror, they weren't ascending. This was deliberate poisoning, some toxin in the food or air or that damn tea, a slow-acting agent timed to peak at midnight, dissolving organs from within, bodies liquefying in graphic slow motion as enzymes or acids ate through tissue, gasps turning to gurgles as lungs filled with frothy blood, eyes bulging in sockets before rupturing with pops like overripe grapes. Panic clawed up my throat as my own vision swam, the bitterness surging, my limbs heavy as if lead coursed my veins. The leader reached for me, fingers bony and cold, nails digging into my wrist with surprising strength, eyes pleading through the haze. "Join us. Be renewed in dissolution." Her skin sloughed off in her grip, leaving slick residue on my arm, maggots wriggling from exposed flesh where infection had set in long before. I wrenched away, stumbling as the circle devolved into a heap of convulsing forms, moans rising in a chorus of agony that echoed off the oaks, bodies arching in rictus as spines snapped from seizures, fluids pooling in the mud to form viscous puddles that reflected the moon's indifferent gaze. I ran blindly into the fog, branches whipping my face, drawing blood that mixed with tears, the chants fading to wet rasps behind me. By midnight, fireworks distant in some normal town, I collapsed miles away, vomiting until my stomach cramped, the poison working but not fully taken. Perhaps my late arrival spared me the full dose. Dawn found me at a road, flagging a trucker who drove me to hospital, where doctors pumped my stomach, muttering about hallucinogens or contaminated water, dismissing my ravings as delirium. I don't know if they all perished, bodies rotting in that glen, or if survivors linger, pale and waiting, luring more with herbal teas that promise renewal, but deliver slow, agonizing decay. The bitterness lingers on my tongue sometimes, a phantom taste that makes food ash, and I wonder if traces remain, eroding me from within. This year I'm barricaded home, doors bolted, no trips, just survival. But the resolution feels fragile, as if the unveiling follows me, waiting for my guard to drop. My family has this weird tradition for New Year's Eve that I never questioned until a couple years ago, when it all started feeling less like some quirky ritual and more like something that's been eating away at us from the inside, slow and steady, without anyone admitting it out loud. This creeping sense that every time we sit down and do it, we're peeling back another layer of ourselves, exposing raw nerves that weren't meant to see the light. And once they're out, they just throb and fester in the quiet days that follow, turning family dinners into these tense standoffs where nobody meets anybody's eyes. We don't do the usual stuff. No countdowns with cheap champagne bubbling over in mismatched glasses or watching fireworks burst across the TV screen while the kids whine about staying up late and the adults pretend they're not already thinking about the headaches tomorrow will bring. Instead, every year as the clock creeps toward midnight, we all gather in the old living room at my grandparents' house out in the suburbs, the one with the faded floral wallpaper that's peeling at the corners like old skin flaking away, and that musty smell from decades of unopened windows letting in drafts that whisper through the cracks, carrying the faint rot of something long buried in the walls. We sit in a circle on the floor, no cushions or anything to soften it, just the hard planks under that worn Persian rug with its threads unraveling like veins coming undone. No lights except for a single lamp in the corner with its yellowed shade casting long shadows that make everyone's faces look hollow and strange, eyes sinking deeper into sockets as the night wears on, cheekbones sharpening like they're being carved out by invisible hands. It's been that way as long as I can remember, starting when I was maybe 8 or 9, dragged out of bed by my mom who always looked more tired than excited, her eyes red-rimmed like she'd been up worrying long before the rest of us, whispering that it was time and we couldn't skip it, not ever, because Grandpa said so and his word was law in that house, heavy as the old oak beams creaking overhead. The first time it really hit me how off it all was happened 3 years back, when I was home from college for the break, sitting cross-legged on that worn carpet with the pattern that's faded to nothing in spots from years of feet shuffling over it during these nights, the lamp buzzing faintly overhead like it was struggling to stay on, its filament trembling as if it knew what was coming and wanted no part of it. My sister was there too, fresh out of high school and already looking worn down from whatever dead-end job she'd picked up at the mall to pay for her community college classes, her nails bitten to the quick and dark circles under her eyes that she tried to hide with cheap concealer that always smeared by evening. Our parents were across from us, Mom fidgeting with her wedding ring like she always does when she's nervous, twisting it around her finger until the skin turns red and raw, Dad staring at the floor as if he could find answers in the faded swirls of the rug, his hands clasped tight enough that his knuckles stood out white against the age spots starting to dot his skin. Grandpa had passed the year before, a quiet death in his sleep that nobody talked about much except to say it was peaceful. But the emptiness where he used to sit, right at the head of the circle with his back to the lamp so his face was always half-shadowed, made everything feel unbalanced, like the circle was broken and we were all leaning toward the gap without realizing it. This subtle pull toward the void he'd left behind that made the room feel colder, the air thicker, as if his absence had sucked something vital out of the space. We started like usual, Mom going first with something mild about how she'd been snapping at Dad over little things, the dishes piling up in the sink, or the laundry left unfolded in baskets for days, and how it built up because she felt invisible sometimes, like we all moved around her without seeing the weight she carried, her voice cracking a bit at the end as she trailed off, staring at her hands folded in her lap, the veins standing out blue and fragile under her thinning skin. Then Dad admitted he'd been drinking more than he let on, hiding bottles in the garage behind stacks of old tools rusted from disuse because work was grinding him down with endless meetings and deadlines that loomed like storm clouds. The layoffs rumors circulating like whispers in the break room making him lie awake at night wondering if we'd lose the house, his hands shaking as he spoke, knuckles whitening further as if squeezing hard enough could hold back the flood of whatever else was bubbling under the surface. My sister went next, mumbling at first about how she'd been shoplifting small stuff, lipstick, earrings, cheap jewelry that caught the light in the store displays, from her job, not because she needed it, but because it made her feel in control for a minute amid the chaos of shifts that left her feet aching and her mind numb, her face flushing red as she avoided our eyes, the shame hanging in the air like a fog that made it hard to breathe. When it got to me, I froze for a second, the pressure building in my chest like it does every year, this invisible weight pressing down until words feel trapped in your throat. But I forced out something about how I'd been lying to them about school, failing a couple classes because I couldn't focus, spending nights scrolling through endless feeds instead of studying, feeling like a failure but too scared to ask for help, the admission tasting bitter on my tongue as I stared at the rug, tracing the faded patterns with my eyes to avoid seeing their reactions. We sat there after the first round, the silence stretching thin and taut like a wire ready to snap, everyone staring at their hands or the floor, the lamp's light making our shadows twist into shapes that looked wrong, elongated and distorted like we weren't quite human anymore, fingers lengthening into claws that reached across the carpet toward each other. That night, though, it didn't stop at the usual confessions like it had in years past, where we'd hug it out awkwardly and promise to do better in hushed voices, stumbling to bed with that temporary lightness from getting things off our chests, a fragile peace that never lasted more than a few weeks before the old patterns crept back in. Mom looked around the circle, her eyes lingering on each of us longer than normal, this searching gaze that made my skin prickle like she was seeing through to the bones beneath, and said we needed to go deeper this year, that Grandpa had always insisted on it when things felt off, like the family was carrying too much unspoken weight that was rotting us from the core, her voice steady but edged with something desperate, like she was pleading without saying it outright. She pulled out this old leather-bound book from under the couch, one I'd seen gathering dust on the high shelves in the den but never touched. Its cover cracked and darkened with age, pages yellowed and brittle like dried leaves ready to crumble at a breath, smelling of dust and something sharper, like old blood dried into the binding or the faint metallic tang of rust from forgotten nails hammered into family secrets. It was a journal, she explained in that same measured tone, started by our great-grandfather back in the 40s after he came home from the war, changed in ways nobody talked about. Entries scrawled in faded ink with dates jumping erratically, handwriting shifting from neat to frantic as the years progressed, describing the same tradition, but with details that made my skin crawl. Nights where confessions turned into accusations that drew blood, literally in some cases, family members breaking down completely, admitting things that shattered relationships beyond repair, leading to divorces that left kids bounced between homes like unwanted baggage, or estrangements that echoed down generations like curses whispered in the dark. As she read aloud, her voice steady but thin, like she was forcing the words out through a narrowing throat, I felt the room grow colder, despite the heater rattling in the corner, the shadows sharpening as if the lamp's light was being absorbed by the book itself, everyone's breathing syncing up in this uneasy rhythm that made my chest tight. Dad shifted uncomfortably, admitting he'd been seeing someone at work, not full-on cheating, but close enough with stolen kisses in parking lots and texts deleted in guilt. Late nights that weren't about overtime, but about escaping the silence at home. His voice breaking as Mom's face crumpled like paper in a fist, tears silent but steady down her cheeks, tracing paths over the fine lines that had deepened there over the years. My sister adapted her turn, confessing she'd been cutting herself, small lines on her thighs hidden under jeans and long skirts. Not deep enough to scar badly, but enough to draw blood that beaded up bright red against her pale skin. The pain a sharp focus amid the numbness that had settled over her like a fog she couldn't shake, pulling up her sleeve to show faint scars that crisscrossed like a map of unspoken hurts, the sight making me flinch inwardly as the room seemed to tilt slightly. The book had more, entries about how the tradition started as a way to purge the family's darkness before the new year, to air out the rot so it didn't spread, but over generations it evolved, or devolved, into something that left people changed, hollowed out, with some never recovering, like an aunt who'd vanished after one particularly brutal night in the 70s. Her last confession about an affair that tore the family in two, her car found abandoned by a bridge with no body ever recovered, or a cousin who'd ended up in a hospital after admitting things that drove him over the edge, ranting about voices in the walls until they strapped him down and medicated him into silence. As Mom kept reading, flipping pages with hands that trembled now, the confessions kept coming, circling back around the circle like a noose tightening, each turn digging deeper into the muck we'd all been avoiding, voices hoarse from the strain, faces slick with sweat despite the chill that had seeped into the room like groundwater rising in a basement. Dad talked about his anger, how he'd hit Mom once years ago, just once in a blackout rage over money or something trivial, his hand connecting with her cheek in a slap that echoed in his memory like a gunshot, the shame festering like an infected wound that never healed. And she nodded slowly, admitting she'd thought about leaving so many times, packing bags in secret while we were at school, but always unpacking them before we got home, staying only for us kids, but resenting it deep down, her words landing like blows that made my sister sob harder, clutching her arms where the cuts hid. I don't know what made me say it, but I blurted out how I'd been resenting them all, blaming them for my failures in school and life, wishing sometimes I could just leave and never look back, start over without the weight of their expectations dragging me down, the words tumbling out bitter and raw, tasting like bile as they hung there, poisoning the air further. The air grew thick, hard to draw in. Everyone's breathing labored now, eyes glassy like we were all slipping into some shared trance or fever, the lamp's light dimming as if the bulb was failing or the power was being siphoned away by the book itself. Shadows pooling in the corners like ink spilling across paper, creeping closer with each revelation. By 2 a.m, we were all wrecked, sitting in that circle with red eyes and trembling hands. The book closed, but its weight still pressing down like a stone on our chests, making it hard to expand lungs fully, this suffocating presence that lingered in the room long after the pages stopped turning. Mom said that was the point, to face the worst before the year turned, to start fresh without the baggage weighing us down like anchors in deep water. But it didn't feel fresh at all. It felt like we'd torn open old wounds that were now infected, festering in the open air with no bandages to stem the flow, blood metaphorically seeping into the carpet and staining it darker in spots that no cleaner could touch. We didn't hug it out that night. We just drifted to beds in silence, the house feeling emptier, colder, like we'd left parts of ourselves behind in that circle, fragments of soul or sanity scattered on the floor amid the unspoken aftermath. The next day, no one mentioned it, but the tension lingered like a bad smell you can't source, conversations clipped and sharp, eyes avoiding each other over breakfast as if looking too long might reopen the floodgates, small arguments flaring over nothing, a spilled coffee, a misplaced key, escalating quicker than before, words carrying the edge of last night's confessions like hidden blades. Dad drank more in the weeks that followed, bottles clinking in the recycling bin with increasing frequency, his steps unsteady in the evenings as he retreated to the garage, the smell of whiskey seeping under doors like a fog. Mom withdrew into long silences, staring out windows at nothing, her hands idle in her lap where they used to knit or fold laundry, the ring twisting endlessly until the skin blistered raw. My sister stopped coming home as often, her visits brief and strained, excuses about work or friends ringing hollow as the bags under her eyes deepened, the scars on her arms fresher if you knew where to look. And me, I found myself replaying the confessions at night, the words echoing in my head like a tape loop that wouldn't stop, sleep coming fitful and haunted by dreams where we sat in that circle forever, confessions piling up until they buried us alive, the lamp's light fading to black as shadows swallowed us whole. Last year was worse, the tradition pulling us back like an addiction we couldn't kick, the invitations going out from Mom in early December with that same insistent tone, like skipping it would invite something worse than the ritual itself, a void that would swallow the family whole if we didn't feed it our darkness. We gathered again in that same living room, the carpet cleaned but still bearing faint stains if you looked close, the lamp humming with the same weary buzz, but now there were fewer of us, my aunt and uncle joining for the first time in years, their faces lined with whatever private hells they'd been nursing, the circle larger but feeling tighter, like the walls had inched closer while we weren't looking. The book came out earlier, before midnight even hit, Mom flipping to newer entries from the 80s, her voice quavering as she read about nights where confessions led to breakdowns that ended in hospitals or worse, like the time my great-uncle admitted to something unspeakable from his youth, a hit-and-run that left a kid mangled on a back road, the guilt festering until he slashed his wrists right there in the circle, blood spraying across the rug in arcs that soaked into the fibers, family scrambling to staunch the flow while he babbled about shadows chasing him. As she read, the confessions started pouring out faster, circling back multiple times, digging into fresh hurts piled on the old ones, Dad admitting the affair had gone further than he'd said last year, full betrayals in motel rooms that smelled of cheap perfume and regret, details spilling out graphic and unfiltered until Mom retched dryly, her face ashen as she confessed she'd known all along, followed him once and watched from the car, the pain twisting inside her like a knife that never stopped turning. My aunt revealed she'd been poisoning her husband's food slowly, small doses of something from the garden shed to make him sicker, weaker, because she couldn't stand his control anymore, her hands shaking as she described the satisfaction of watching him waste away, bedridden now with doctors baffled. Uncle countered with his own admission, how he'd been touching the neighbor's kid years back. Nothing serious, he claimed, but the words hung there like a noose, the room spinning as my sister screamed at him, confessing she'd seen it once and said nothing, the guilt carving her up inside worse than any blade. I don't remember what I said next, but it came out in a rush, how I'd driven drunk last summer and clipped a cyclist, leaving them crumpled on the road without stopping, the thump echoing in my dreams every night, blood on the bumper washed away but staining my hands in waking hours. The room spun that night, or maybe it was just us, the lamp's light pulsing like a migraine aura, shadows seeming to move on their own, coiling around ankles and wrists like living restraints that tightened with each word, the air thick with the smell of sweat and something metallic, like blood from bitten tongues. By 3, we were all crying, voices raw from shouting accusations that blurred into self-loathing, the book lying open like a Pandora's box we'd pried too far, entries from the past seeming to whisper as pages fluttered in a draft from nowhere. Dad stormed out at one point, came back with bruises on his knuckles from punching the wall outside, blood dripping steady onto the carpet, staining it dark in fresh spots that mingled with the old. My aunt collapsed at some point, hyperventilating until her lips turned blue, Uncle hovering over her with this vacant look, like he'd already checked out. We didn't stop until dawn filtered gray through the curtains, exhausted and broken, promises to change feeling hollow as always, the house echoing with the ghosts of what we'd said, words that couldn't be unsaid hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that refused to die. In the weeks after, things unraveled faster. Dad disappeared for days, found in a motel with empty bottles and a note that rambled about ending it. Mom hospitalized for what they called a breakdown, but we knew was the weight finally crushing her. My sister vanishing into some rehab program without a goodbye. Her last text a string of accusations that cut deeper than her scars. And me? I've been losing time. Blackouts where I wake with blood under my nails or bruises I don't remember getting. The tradition's pull feeling like tendrils wrapped around my brain, urging me back each year to feed it more. This year, I'm dreading it more than ever. The invitations went out weeks ago, Mom insisting from her facility that we need it now more than ever. Like the tradition's the only thing holding what's left of us together. But it feels like it's tearing us apart, piece by piece, confession by confession, until we're all just hollow shells wandering the house like ghosts. I've been losing sleep over it, replaying the nights in my head until the words blend into a cacophony that drowns out everything else. The lamp's light haunting my dreams where we sit in that circle forever, confessions piling up until they bury us alive under their weight, the shadows rising to consume us as the book laughs silently from the center. Part of me wants to skip it, burn the book and the house with it, drive away and not look back until the suburbs fade in the rear view. But the pull's there. This compulsion-like skipping would break something irreversible, invite the darkness we've been purging to flood in unchecked, rotting us from within until we're nothing but echoes of the family we used to be. If you're reading this, scrawled out on this library computer at some ungodly hour because home feels like a tomb closing in, maybe talk me out of going, or tell me how to break it without losing what's left of us, because surviving another night like that doesn't feel possible anymore. The dread building like a scream stuck in my throat, waiting for midnight to set it free. The New Year's Eve. I'm thinking about started the way too many of mine have, alone in a house that didn't feel like mine anymore, nursing a bottle of cheap red wine I'd picked up on the way out from the city, staring at walls that used to hold up a family but now just echoed with the kind of quiet that presses in on you until it's hard to think straight. Every creak of the old floorboards sounding like footsteps from rooms that should be empty, every shift of shadow in the corner of your eye making you wonder if the place is holding its breath, waiting for you to admit something you've buried deep. The silence, not just absence of noise, but something thicker, like it's filled with all the unsaid words that piled up over the years, waiting to spill out if you listen too closely. My parents had only been gone 6 weeks, taken out suddenly by a stroke for Mom and a heart attack for Dad 3 days later, like he couldn't face the world without her. Their bodies found in the kitchen where they'd collapsed one after the other, coffee still warm on the table and the radio playing some old song they used to dance to in better years. The paramedics saying it looked like they went quick, but who really knows what those last moments felt like, alone in that room with the realization hitting that this was it. No more arguments or reconciliations, just the end staring back from the linoleum floor. I'd inherited the house outright, this creaky Victorian on the edge of a small town in upstate New York where the winters drag on forever and the fog rolls in thick from the lake whenever the temperature drops just right. The kind of fog that swallows sound and light until you feel like the only person left alive, cut off from everything except your own thoughts looping in the gray. My brother and sister had their own lives miles away, kids and mortgages and reasons not to deal with the upkeep or the memories. So it fell to me to sort through decades of accumulated life, boxes of photos yellowing at the edges with faces staring out accusingly, clothes still hanging in closets that smelled of mothballs and lavender sachets. Mom swore kept the moths away, but now just reminded me of funeral homes, furniture scarred from years of arguments and reconciliations that never quite stuck, each nick and dent a reminder of slammed doors or thrown objects that missed their mark but left lasting impressions anyway. I'd come up that afternoon to start packing, telling myself I'd listed in spring when the market picked up and people might see past the dated fixtures to the potential underneath. But as the sun vanished early behind bare trees and the sky turned that bruised purple of late December, leaving the rooms in a dim half-light that made everything look faded and tired, I decided to stay through midnight. One last New Year's in the house where I grew up, no matter how many ghosts lingered in the hallways or how many rooms felt smaller than they used to, like the walls had inched closer while I wasn't looking, closing in with all the weight of things left unresolved. By 7, the wine was hitting warm and fuzzy, loosening the knot in my chest into something looser but not gone, just unraveled enough that the edges frayed and caught on every little thing, making me linger over details I'd ignored on previous visits, like the scuff marks on the baseboards from where Dad used to kick his boots off without looking, or the faint outline on the wall where a picture had hung for years before Mom took it down in one of her quiet rages, never explaining why but leaving the space empty like a scar that wouldn't heal. I wandered the ground floor, flipping lights on in rooms I hadn't entered since the funeral, the air thick with dust motes dancing in the beams like tiny specters disturbed from sleep, swirling in patterns that almost looked deliberate if you stared too long, the switches clicking under my fingers with that old house resistance that made you wonder if the wiring was still safe or if one day it'd all short out in a blaze that consumed everything, memories and regrets alike. The living room still had the same sagging couch where Dad used to fall asleep during Sunday football, the fabric worn thin in spots from his weight settling in night after night. The coffee table scarred from years of feet propped up and glasses set down too hard during arguments that started over nothing and ended with slammed doors echoing through the house. The mantel lined with framed photos that told a story I'd stopped being part of long ago, me as a kid grinning gap-toothed at birthday cakes with candles guttering in the flash. Then fewer pictures as the years went on, my face turning sullen in the background while my siblings took center stage with graduations and weddings and babies, their lives unfolding in ways that fit the narrative my parents wanted, while mine veered off into dead ends they couldn't understand or forgive. I poured another glass, the bottle sweating in my hand as the cold from outside seeped through the windows despite the seals I'd checked earlier, and sank into the armchair by the window, pulling back the heavy curtains that smelled faintly of mildew to peer out at the front yard, expecting the usual view of dead grass brittle under frost and the old oak that leaned like it was tired of standing after a century of winters, its branches bare and twisted like fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. But instead, fog had rolled in thick and sudden, a wall of gray that swallowed the porch light after only a few feet, turning the world beyond into a blank void where shapes might move or might not. The kind of fog that deadens sound until your own breathing feels too loud, too intrusive in the silence, pressing against the glass like it had substance, making the panes fog up from the inside as condensation beaded and trickled down in slow rivulets that caught the light oddly, refracting it into prisms that danced across the room. It wasn't unusual for the area. The lake effect could bring it quick and heavy, rolling off the water a few miles away when the air turned just right, blanketing everything in this suffocating white that made driving impossible and walking feel like stepping into nothing. But this felt different, denser, like it had weight pressing against the house, making the window pane bow inward ever so slightly with each gust that wasn't really there. Or maybe that was the wine playing tricks, the room tilting as I stared into the nothingness outside, the yard vanishing inch by inch until even the oak's trunk dissolved into the gray, leaving me with this uneasy sense that the world had shrunk to just the house, isolated in a sea of nothing where anything could be lurking just beyond sight. I laughed it off at first, a nervous bark that echoed too sharp in the empty house, bouncing off walls that seemed to absorb it wrong, muting it into something smaller, and turned up the heat, the old furnace rumbling to life in the basement with a groan that vibrated through the floors like something waking below, pipes clanging in protest as hot air pushed through vents that hadn't been cleaned in years, stirring up dust that danced in the light like ashes from a fire long burned out. The wine helped, loosening limbs and thoughts into something looser, but not gone, just unraveled enough that the edges frayed and caught on every little thing, making me linger over details I'd ignored on previous visits, like the scuff marks on the baseboards from where Dad used to kick his boots off without looking, leaving black streaks that Mom would scrub at furiously with a rag soaked in vinegar, her knees creaking as she bent down, muttering under her breath about carelessness that always felt aimed at more than just the marks. I rummaged through the kitchen cabinets, finding half-empty bottles of liquor my parents had saved for company that rarely came, dust coating the labels like a fine gray film, the glass cold under my fingers as I mixed a drink that burned going down but warmed from the inside, chasing away the chill that had settled despite the thermostat climbing, the house resisting the heat like it preferred the cold, the kind that seeps into bones and stays there, making joints ache with memories of winters spent shoveling driveways or huddling under blankets during power outages that left us in darkness for days. Around 9, I put on some music. Old records from Dad's collection stacked in the corner cabinet, vinyl crackling as the needle dropped, spinning out jazz standards that filled the rooms with saxophone wails and brushed drums that sounded mournful in the empty space, masking the quiet that had started feeling watchful, like the house was listening to every step, every breath, judging the intrusions. But the fog kept thickening, visible even through drawn curtains as a pressure against the windows, the glass fogging up from the contrast of inside heat and outside cold, and I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more. The music suddenly too loud or not loud enough. The spaces between notes stretching into silences where I swore I heard faint scratches at the siding, slow and deliberate, like nails testing for weakness in the wood, circling the house in a pattern that felt calculated, pausing at each window before moving on as if mapping the vulnerabilities. The sound came again around 10, clearer this time, a drag along the back wall that made the hairs on my arms stand up despite the warmth from the drink, like fingers trailing lazily across the clapboard, leaving invisible marks that I could almost feel through the insulation, the kind of touch that lingers on skin long after it's gone. I muted the record player, the sudden quiet rushing in like water filling a void, heart picking up in my chest as I listened. But all I got was that ticking clock in the hall, steady and insistent, counting down to nothing, its pendulum swinging with a soft click that echoed too far in the empty house. The scrape repeated, closer now, right under the kitchen window maybe, and I backed away, spilling wine on the linoleum that spread dark like blood under the fluorescent bulb, pooling in the grout lines and seeping slowly toward the edges as if drawn by some unseen force. Rational thoughts kicked in then. Probably a branch caught in the wind scraping against the house, or raccoons rooting around the foundation in search of warmth or food scraps. But there was no wind, the fog hanging still and heavy outside. Not a leaf stirring on the trees I could barely make out through the haze. And as I stood there frozen, the light above flickered once, twice, the bulb humming louder, like it was straining against something pulling at the power from outside, the wires in the walls groaning faintly as if under tension. I checked the locks on the doors again, the deadbolts sliding home with a click that echoed too loud in the quiet, reassuring in the moment but hollow after. the metal cold under my fingers like it had absorbed the chill from beyond the wood. And that's when I noticed the front door's handle turning slowly, back and forth, like someone testing it from outside with patient insistence, the metal creaking under pressure before stopping abruptly, leaving the silence heavier, pregnant with the expectation of the next move. Panic started bubbling up then, that wine-fueled haze sharpening into something colder, more primal, and I backed toward the stairs, phone in hand dialing 911 with thumbs that slipped on the screen from sweat or nerves, but the call wouldn't connect. No bars showing despite the signal being fine earlier. Just that spinning wheel mocking me as the fog seemed to thicken even more. Pressing against the glass like it was alive and hungry, tendrils seeping through cracks I didn't know were there, cold and damp fogging the inside panes now. The murmurs started then, low at first, like wind through leaves but forming words, rising and falling in a cadence that tugged at memories I didn't want to touch. Voices carried on the mist that had infiltrated the house somehow, whispering from vents and under doors. My name drawn out and wet, like spoken through mouths full of water or soil, mixed with sobs or laughter that twisted into something ugly, the kind of sound that burrows into your brain and echoes long after it's gone. I fled upstairs, the steps creaking under my weight like they were protesting the intrusion, the banister slick under my palm as if coated in condensation that had no business being there, the hallway dark but familiar with doors to empty bedrooms standing open like mouths waiting to swallow secrets or screams. And I ducked into my old room, the one they'd left untouched since I moved out years ago after the big fight. The bed still made with the same quilt faded from washes and sunlight, posters curling at edges from humidity that seeped in during summers when the AC struggled, the air in there stale like it had been holding its breath waiting for me to return. I locked the door, though it was just a flimsy knob lock that wouldn't hold against a determined push, and sat on the bed, phone clutched tight trying emergency mode but still nothing, the signal jammed or swallowed by whatever was out there in the fog that now pressed against the upstairs windows too, the glass fogging from the inside as if the cold had breached the walls entirely. The murmurs filtered up now, clearer through the vents that carried heat, but now seemed to channel voices instead, words forming into sentences I knew too well. Mom's soft lilt turning sharp with disappointment, Dad's gruff tone laced with resentment, overlapping with my siblings' distant laughter from years when we were still close before the rifts widened into chasms. I huddled on the bed, knees drawn up, as the voices named sins I'd buried deep. The lies to Mom about where I was the night I totaled the car drunk, swerving home from a party I shouldn't have been at, the metal crunching against a tree that left me walking away with bruises but guilt that festered like an open wound. The money stolen from Dad's wallet to feed habits I never admitted, small bills at first but adding up until he noticed and confronted me in shouts that echoed through the house, his face red and veined like he was on the verge of bursting. The way I'd cut contact after the fight over my life choices, leaving them to age alone in this house while I built a life in the city that felt empty despite the noise, their calls going unanswered until the guilt ate at me in quiet moments, but never enough to pick up the phone. The door rattled then, not the knob, but the whole frame shaking as if something heavy leaned into it from the other side, testing the give with patient insistence, the wood groaning under strain like it was alive and in pain, splintering faintly at the edges where nails had loosened over years of settling. Downstairs, thumps started, heavy footsteps crossing the floor, creaking boards I'd memorized as a kid sneaking in late now carrying weight that didn't belong, slow and deliberate like they were savoring the approach, the murmurs swelling into full voices, overlapping in chaos that filled the house. You left us to rot. Always the selfish one. Come down and face what you've done. I backed against the headboard, heart pounding in my ears as the door buckled further, hinges screaming in protest, and the fog seeped under the gap, cold and damp against my skin, carrying that same murmur closer, voices pressing through the cracks in the plaster like they could manifest from the wallpaper itself, the patterns on it seeming to shift in the dim light from my phone's flashlight, flowers twisting into faces with mouths open in silent screams. The air grew thicker, harder to draw in, the room closing like the fog outside had invaded fully, shadows pooling in the corners like ink spilling across paper, creeping closer with each rattle of the door, the smell of decay filtering in now, like wet earth and something sweeter, rotting fruit or flesh left too long in the damp. The voices named more, dredging up the accident I'd caused years ago, swerving drunk and hitting the pedestrian who'd staggered into the road from the shadows. The thump of body on hood echoing as bones crunched under tires. A graphic impact that left me staring in the rear view at a twisted form in the road, blood pooling dark under streetlights as I drove on in panic, leaving them broken and dying in the ditch while I raced home to wash the evidence. The news reports later calling it a hit-and-run that killed a father of two. His family shattered in ways that mirrored my own but worse. Kids left fatherless, wife hollowed by loss that ate at her until she followed him years later in a quiet overdose the papers barely mentioned. The figures coalesced then from the fog seeping in, not solid at first, but gaining form as the door splintered inward with a crack like breaking bones, shards flying across the room to embed in the walls and floor like accusing fingers. Mom's shape led, her face pale and bloated as if drowned, skin sloughing in wet sheets to reveal muscle and bone beneath, eyes milky with cataracts or decay staring blind but knowing, mouth opening to exhale a breath that reeked of lake-bottom mud and regret, her hands reaching with fingers elongated and dripping, nails split and blackened as they grazed my arm, leaving trails of cold that burned like frostbite spreading under skin. Dad followed, his form twisted with the rot of years unspoken, flesh hanging loose from a frame wasted by unspoken cancers, veins bulging dark and pulsing with something thicker than blood, his grip closing on my leg with strength that crushed, bones grinding under pressure as he pulled, whispering accusations that cut deeper than any knife. You did this to us, left us to wither while you ran. My siblings materialized from the swirl, faces warped into mocking versions with skin peeled back in strips to show grinning skulls beneath, mouths sewn in permanent rictus smiles with threads that snapped as they laughed, a sound like cracking ice over deep water, hands clawing at my chest as if to rip out the heart that hadn't stopped me from abandoning them all. The fog choked the room fully now, visions flashing graphic and unrelenting of their deaths replayed from their eyes. Mom alone in the hospital bed, machines beeping erratic as fluids filled lungs. She drowned in slow, gasping agony without me there to hold her hand, her body convulsing in final throes as foam flecked lips that whispered my name in betrayal. Dad's heart seizing in the kitchen, collapsing over cold coffee with arteries bursting like overpressured hoses, blood flooding chambers until he clutched his chest in silent scream, eyes bulging as he crawled toward the phone, fingers numb and failing, my name a curse unspoken on bluing lips. Their forms pressed closer, flesh sloughing onto me in wet sheets that stuck like second skin. Maggots writhing from open wounds where disease had eaten them from within, burrowing into my arms as cold filled my veins like ice water injected straight to the heart. Breath coming in gasps as they forced memories deeper. The night I left after the big fight, slamming the door on Mom's tears that streamed like blood from fresh cuts. Dad's shouted slurs echoing as I drove away into the night, never calling back even when the cancer diagnosis came. Her body wasting to skin over bones in graphic slow motion. Chemo ravaging hair and dignity until she was a husk begging for visits I ignored, his care for her breaking him, until the heart attack claimed him mid-sentence on a voicemail I deleted unheard. The figures twisted further into the man from the accident, his face mangled and accusing with skull caved in from the impact, brain matter gray and congealed leaking from cracks, hands clawing at my throat with fingers broken and splintered from trying to break his fall, forcing me to relive the thump of body on hood. The wet crunch of bones under wheels as I accelerated away. Blood spraying across the windshield like rain from a storm of my making. His family's grief playing out in visions of kids wailing at a grave dug too soon. Wife hollowed by loss that ate at her until she slit wrists in a tub, red blooming in water like the stain I'd left on the road. The fog choked me fully, lungs burning as if filled with water or smoke, visions tunneling as cold claimed limbs, numbness spreading like gangrene from their touch, the house groaning around us as if joining the chorus, walls cracking with the weight of accumulated sins. I woke gasping on the floor come morning, fog lifted like it had never been, house silent but wrecked, doors splintered inward with claw marks gouging deep into wood that wept sap like blood from fresh wounds, walls smeared with muddy handprints that dripped viscous trails down to the baseboards, furniture overturned and shredded as if by animals in blind rage, upholstery torn in strips that hung like flayed skin, the air still thick with that decay smell clinging to my clothes and skin, seeping into pores until I could taste it on every breath. My body ached with bruises shaped like hands that wrapped around arms and legs, scratches weeping blood that crusted black overnight in patterns like accusations scrawled in flesh. And in the mirror, my eyes held shadows that weren't mine, pupils dilated as if staring into endless gray, whispers lingering at the edge of hearing promising return when the fog rolls in again, a cycle unbroken by dawn's light. The tradition wasn't staying, it was summoning them back, the unresolved rising with the new year to drag me down, their resentment made manifest in the mist that never quite clears from this house, seeping into dreams where they wait patient and decaying, ready to pull me under. Next time the temperature drops and the lake exhales its cold breath. This year, as the invitations arrive for family gatherings I can't avoid despite the emptiness, I know skipping means they come unbidden, fog thicker and more insistent, forms more solid and hungry, ready to finish pulling me into the cold where regrets drown you forever. Their embraces rotting flesh that sloughs onto yours until you can't tell where they end and you begin. I've written this from a motel because home's unsafe, the walls whispering already with their voices, faint but growing, the fog gathering early this winter like it's eager for the reunion. If you're reading, tell me how to end it. Burn the place, scatter the ashes in running water, something, before next midnight brings them solid, chilled hands closing around my throat, dragging me into the fog where their rotting embrace waits eternal, the decay spreading until I'm one of them, lost in the gray forever.